The tears wouldn't stop falling as Clara Whitmore gripped the worn leather seats of the stagecoach, her entire world destroyed by one man's lies. In 1873, Boston, refusing a powerful man's son, had cost her everything: her teaching position, her reputation, her future. Now, as the dusty plains of Wyoming stretched endlessly before her, she was about to meet Jonah McAllister, a stranger who'd paid for her passage west as his mail-order bride. She had nothing left to lose, or so she thought. Welcome to a story of redemption, unexpected love, and the courage to start over when all seems lost. Stay with me until the end, and comment your city below. I'd love to see how far our story travels today. The stagecoach lurched violently over another rut in the dirt road, sending Clara's stomach into her throat. She pressed her handkerchief harder against her eyes, but the tears kept coming, soaking through the delicate lace that had once belonged to her mother. Outside the Wyoming Territory stretched in all directions, endless brown plains dotted with sagebrush, so different from the cobblestone streets and gas lamps of Boston she'd left behind. "Willow Creek next stop," the driver bellowed from his perch above. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the end of her journey and the beginning of what? A lie. A desperate gamble. She didn't even know anymore. All she knew was that Jonah McAllister would be waiting on that platform, expecting to meet the respectable schoolteacher who'd answered his advertisement in the Boston Herald. Not the ruined woman she'd become. She fumbled in her valise for the letter now creased from countless readings during the 5-day journey west. His handwriting was strong and clear, just like his words. "Miss Whitmore, your letter touched me deeply. A woman of education and refinement would be a blessing to this rough country. I promise you a good home, respect and partnership in building something lasting. I am not a rich man, but I'm honest and hardworking. If you're willing to take this chance, I'll make sure you never regret it." Jonah McAllister. Partnership, respect. The words mocked her now. How could she tell him the truth that Clara Whitmore, 26 years old, formerly of Beacon Hill's finest families, was now a pariah, that her name was whispered in Boston's drawing rooms as a cautionary tale? The coach began to slow, and through the dust-covered window, Clara could see the rough wooden buildings of Willow Creek emerging from the prairie like broken teeth. Her hands trembled as she tried to smooth her traveling dress, a deep blue wool that had seen better days, though it was the finest thing she still owned. "Ma'am?" The driver's assistant appeared at the door, offering his hand. "We've arrived." Clara forced herself to take his rough palm, stepping down onto the wooden platform. The late afternoon sun painted everything golden, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were drawn immediately to the tall figure standing near the station house. Jonah McAllister was nothing like she'd imagined. Where she'd expected a grizzled frontiersman, she found a man perhaps 35 years old, clean-shaven, except for a neat mustache, wearing his best shirt. She could tell by how carefully it had been pressed. His hat was in his hands, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold, deep brown kind, and currently filled with concern. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a gentle drawl that spoke of Southern origins. "I'm Jonah McAllister." She tried to speak, but a sob escaped instead. The exhaustion of 5 days' travel, the weight of her secret, the kindness in his eyes, it all crashed over her at once. She stood there on that platform, tears streaming down her face, while the man who'd paid $300 for her passage west looked on in alarm. "I'm sorry," she managed to choke out. "I'm so sorry. You must think—" "I think you've had a long journey," Jonah said quietly, stepping closer but not touching her. "And I think maybe we should get you somewhere you can rest. My wagon's just over here." He gestured to a sturdy buckboard hitched to 2 bay horses. Without thinking, Clara let him take her valise, the only luggage she'd brought containing everything she owned in the world. His eyebrows rose slightly at its lightness, but he said nothing. "The ranch is about an hour outside town," he said as he helped her onto the wagon seat. His hands were gentle but strong, and she noticed calluses that spoke of hard work. "I've got a woman from town, Mrs. Henderson, staying at the house. Figured you'd want another woman around until you got comfortable." The thoughtfulness of it nearly undid her completely. Here was this stranger showing her more consideration than anyone in Boston had offered in months. The weight of her deception pressed down like a stone on her chest. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clop of horses' hooves. The town fell away behind them, replaced by endless grassland that rippled in the wind like a golden sea. Finally, Jonah cleared his throat. "Miss Whitmore, I don't mean to pry, but are you all right if someone's hurt you or if you're in some kind of trouble?" "Stop." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Please, just stop the wagon." He pulled on the reins immediately, and the horses came to a halt. Clara sat there, hands clenched in her lap, knowing she couldn't go another mile living this lie. "Mr. McAllister, you're a good man. I can see that already, and that's why I can't do this to you." She turned to face him, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I haven't been honest with you. I am a school teacher, was a school teacher. I am educated and from a good family. All of that was true. But I'm not respectable. Not anymore." His expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on the reins. "Go on." 3 months ago, Judge Hartley's son took an interest in me. William Hartley, perhaps you've heard of the family. No, well, they essentially run half of Boston. William decided he wanted me for his mistress. The ugly word tasted bitter on her tongue. When I refused him repeatedly, he cornered me in the schoolroom after hours. She paused. Reliving that horrible evening, the smell of whiskey on his breath, his hands tearing at her dress, her desperate fight to get away. "I struck him with a paperweight," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cut his forehead open. There was so much blood. I thought I'd killed him. I ran home terrified. The next day, the story all over Boston was that I had tried to seduce him for his money, and when he virtuously refused, I attacked him in a jealous rage." Jonah still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Clara forced herself to continue. "The school dismissed me immediately. No one would hire me. My own cousins wouldn't receive me. My landlady evicted me. In 2 weeks, I went from being Miss Whitmore, respected educator, to being that woman, the one who threw herself at William Hartley." A bitter laugh escaped her. The truth didn't matter. His word against mine. There was never any question who would be believed. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and distance. Clara couldn't bear to look at Jonah's face. "I answered your advertisement because I had $20 left to my name and nowhere to go. I thought I could start over here, be someone new. But I can't build a marriage on a lie. So if you want to take me back to town right now, I understand. I'll find work, somehow pay you back for the passage." "Did he hurt you?" The question was so unexpected and asked with such contained fury that Clara's head snapped up. Jonah's kind eyes had gone hard as flint. "Did William Hartley hurt you?" he repeated. He tore my dress, bruised my arms, but I got away before." She couldn't finish the sentence. Jonah nodded slowly, then surprised her by climbing down from the wagon. He walked around to her side and stood there looking up at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Miss Whitmore, Clara, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen real careful. I've been out here for 8 years. Built my ranch from nothing, fought drought and Indians and rustlers. I've seen men do terrible things and call it business. Seen women do desperate things and call it survival. I've learned to judge people by what they do, not what others say about them." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You fought off a man who tried to force himself on you. That takes courage. You told me the truth just now when you could have kept quiet and I'd never have known. That takes honor. And you came out here to the middle of nowhere to marry a complete stranger rather than give up. That takes grit." Clara felt fresh tears threatening. "But your reputation, the other ranchers, their wives, if they knew—" "This isn't Boston," Jonah said firmly. "Half the people in Willow Creek came here to leave something behind. We don't ask too many questions about folks' pasts. What matters is who you are now today and who you want to be tomorrow." He offered her his hand. "Now would you like to see your new home? Mrs. Henderson's probably got supper waiting, and I'd bet you haven't eaten properly in days." Clara stared at his outstretched hand, work-roughened, honest offering, not just help down from a wagon, but acceptance, a chance at redemption. She took it. The rest of the ride passed differently. Jonah pointed out landmarks, a twisted cottonwood that marked the eastern boundary of his land, a creek that ran year-round good for water. He talked about his plans for the ranch, his voice warming with enthusiasm. I've got about 300 head of cattle now, but the land can support more. Been thinking about bringing in some horses too. There's good money in selling to the cavalry. Of course, that's a lot for one man to handle. Been hoping to find a partner who could help with the business side of things, keeping books, writing letters to buyers, that sort of work. I'm good with numbers, Clara offered tentatively. I kept the school's accounts in Boston. That's real good to hear. Ranch work isn't just about cattle, it's about planning, managing resources, making smart decisions. A woman with education could make a real difference out here. As they crested a low hill, Clara got her first view of the McAllister Ranch. It wasn't grand, a sturdy two-story house with a wraparound porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a kitchen garden protected by a fence. But everything was well-maintained, orderly, cared for. You built all this yourself. Had help from neighbors for the barn raising, but yes, mostly. The house started as just 2 rooms, added on as I could afford it. He glanced at her. It's not Beacon Hill, I know. It's wonderful, Clara interrupted and meant it. After months of feeling adrift here was something solid real. It looks like a real home. A black and white dog came bounding toward the wagon, barking joyfully. Jonah smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him. That's Moses. Found him as a pup, half-starved, trying to cross the creek during spring flood. He's a good cattle dog and even better company. Moses ran alongside the wagon tail, wagging furiously. Despite everything, Clara found herself smiling too. As they pulled up to the house, the front door opened and a plump woman in her 50s emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was weathered but kind, with laugh lines around her eyes. About time you got here, she called out. I was starting to worry. This must be Miss Whitmore. Clara, Clara said as Jonah helped her down. Please call me Clara. Mrs. Bond. Henderson studied her with shrewd eyes that seemed to take in everything. The tear-stained face, the too light valise, the way she held herself like she expected a blow. Then the older woman smiled. Well, Clara, you look like you could use a good meal and a hot bath. Jonah McAllister, you take her things up to the guest room and then make yourself scarce. This young lady needs some tending to. Clara found herself swept into the house, Moses trailing behind. The interior was simple, but clean wood floors, modest furniture, a stone fireplace that dominated the main room. It smelled of beeswax polish and something delicious cooking. Now then, Mrs. Henderson said once Jonah had disappeared upstairs with the valise. I've got beef stew keeping warm and fresh bread just out of the oven, but first let's get you cleaned up. There's nothing a hot bath can't improve. An hour later, Clara sat at the kitchen table in a borrowed wrapper of Mrs. Henderson's, her hair still damp, eating the best meal she'd had in months. The older woman bustled about, keeping up a steady stream of chatter about the town, the neighbors, the weather, anything except why a young woman from Boston might arrive in tears with only one small bag to her name. Jonah's a good man, Mrs. Henderson said, finally pouring Clara another cup of coffee. Lost his wife and baby to fever back in Texas. That's why he came out here to start fresh. He's been lonely but particular about it. Didn't want just any woman, wanted someone he could talk to, share ideas with. When he saw your advertisement mentioning you were a teacher, well, his face just lit up. My advertisement? Clara set down her cup in confusion. But I answered his, Oh, did you now? Mrs. Henderson laughed. That man! Too proud to admit he placed an ad and an ad for himself, but I helped him write it so I should know. Respectable rancher seeks educated woman for matrimony. Must be willing to work hard and build something together. Not very romantic, I told him, but he said he wanted someone who knew what they were getting into. Before Clara could respond, Jonah appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. He'd changed his shirt and washed the trail dust from his face. Sorry to interrupt, but Clara, there's something I need to say. Been thinking about it while you were getting settled. Clara tensed, waiting for the conditions, the rules, the reminders of what she owed him. I know we plan to marry quick, that's what mail order arrangements usually are. But given everything, I think maybe we should take some time, get to know each other. You could stay here as my bookkeeper, let's say. Room and board and a fair wage. Then, if in a few months we think we might suit, we can revisit the marriage question. Would that be acceptable to you? Clara stared at him. This man who kept surprising her with his decency. You do that? But people will talk a single woman living here. Mrs. Henderson's agreed to stay on for a while, Jonah said. for propriety's sake. After that, well, we'll figure it out. The point is, you don't owe me anything, Clara. Not marriage, not anything else. You're free to make your own choices here. Free. The word hit her like a physical blow. For months, she'd been trapped by scandal, by poverty, by the walls of society closing in. And here was this stranger offering her freedom. Yes, she whispered. Then stronger. Yes, That's very generous. Thank you. Jonah nodded, looking relieved. Good. That's settled then. Now I'll leave you ladies to your supper. Need to check on the stock before dark. He paused at the door. Clara, welcome to the Triple M Ranch. I think you're going to do just fine here. After he left, Clara sat in the warm kitchen listening to Mrs. Henderson hum as she washed dishes and felt something she hadn't experienced in months' hope. The next morning came too early with Moses barking at something outside. Clara dressed quickly in her simplest day dress, still too fine for ranch life, but it would have to do, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Henderson was already at the stove, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. Jonah's been up for hours, the older woman said by way of greeting. Man never could sleep past dawn. He left these for you. These turned out to be a pair of sturdy boots, a practical bonnet, and a written list of the ranch's accounts that needed reviewing. He wasn't sure of your shoe size, but his late wife's things are stored in the attic. Said you're welcome to anything that might be useful. No point in practical clothes going to waste. The thoughtfulness of it and the delicate way he'd handled what could have been an awkward situation touched Clara deeply. After breakfast, she found the attic ladder and climbed up to find several trunks neatly labeled. Sarah McAllister had been about her size, and her clothes were simple, but well-made cotton work dresses, sturdy skirts, practical blouses. At the bottom of one trunk, wrapped in tissue, was a beautiful blue silk dress, obviously saved for special occasions. Clara fingered the fabric gently, imagining the woman who'd worn it. Who'd lived in this house, loved Jonah, and died too young. She carefully rewrapped it and chose instead several work dresses that would suit her new life. By the time Jonah came in for the noon meal, Clara had transformed. Gone was the Boston lady and her impractical finery. In her place stood a woman ready to work ledgers spread across the kitchen table, pencil in hand. Your bookkeeping is a disaster, she announced without preamble. You're owed money by at least 3 buyers who haven't paid in months, and you've been overpaying for supplies from the general store. We need to renegotiate your contracts. Jonah blinked at her transformation, then a slow smile spread across his face. Is that so? Furthermore, you're not charging enough for your beef. I checked the going rates from the newspapers. You're underselling yourself by at least $2 a head. Well then, Miss Bookkeeper, what do you suggest we do about it? The we wasn't lost on Clara. She straightened, feeling more like herself than she had in months. First, I write letters to those buyers demanding payment, politely but firmly. Then we go to town tomorrow and have a conversation with Mr. Patterson at the general store about fair pricing. And going forward, all sales get recorded properly with contracts and payment terms clearly stated. Yes, ma'am, Jonah said, but he was grinning. Anything else? Yes. You need to teach me about cattle. I can't manage books for a business I don't understand. That afternoon, Jonah took her on a tour of the ranch. He showed her the different pastures, explained about water rights and grazing patterns, introduced her to his 2 ranch hands. Tom, a grizzled older man who'd been with him from the start, and Pete, a young Mexican-American who had a gift with horses. Ma'am, Tom tipped his hat, his weathered face carefully neutral. She could tell he was reserving judgment on this city woman his boss had brought home. Mr. Tom, she replied formally, then surprised him by asking, Jonah tells me you know more about cattle than any man in Wyoming. I'd be grateful if you'd share some of that knowledge when you have time. Tom's expression thawed slightly. Be happy to, ma'am. Takes a smart woman to know what she don't know. As they walked back to the house, Jonah quiet beside her. Clara felt the enormous sky above them, the endless grass around them, and instead of feeling small, she felt free. The air was clean and sharp, washing away the stifling memory of Boston's drawing rooms. It's beautiful here, she said softly. Frightening, but beautiful. Frightening. So much space, so much sky. In Boston, buildings hem you in, tell you where you can and can't go. Here, she gestured at the horizon. Here you could get lost. Or found, Jonah said quietly, depending on what you're looking for. That evening, after Mrs. Henderson had retired to her room, Clara and Jonah sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Moses lay between them, occasionally thumping his tail when one of them moved. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "Why did you really place that advertisement? A man like you, handsome, successful kind, you could have your pick of women." Jonah was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "After Sarah died, I shut myself off. Threw myself into building this place, like if I worked hard enough I could outrun the grief. And I did for a while. Built something I'm proud of, but then I realized I'd built it for no one. What's the point of a legacy with no one to leave it to? What's the point of a beautiful sunset if you've got no one to share it with?" He turned to look at her, his eyes serious in the fading light. "I wasn't looking for just any woman, Clara. I was looking for a partner. Someone who could see what this place could be, not just what it is. Someone who wouldn't be afraid of the work or the isolation. Someone who could teach our children." He paused, color rising in his cheeks. "That is any future children more than just ranching. Give them education, culture, options. And you thought you'd find that through a newspaper advertisement. Worked, didn't it?" He smiled slightly. "You're here." "I'm here because I had nowhere else to go," Clara reminded him. "No." Jonah disagreed. "You could have gone anywhere. California, Oregon, anywhere west. You could have lied about your past, created a whole new identity. You could have done a lot of things, but you chose to answer an advertisement for a wife in Wyoming. That takes a particular kind of courage." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, more stars than Clara had ever seen in her life. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. "Jonah," she said finally, "what if we don't suit? What if after a few months we realize we've made a mistake? Then I'll have had the pleasure of your company for those months, and you'll have had time to figure out your next step. Either way, we're both better off than we were. You're a strange man, Jonah McAllister." "Maybe, but I prefer to think of myself as practical. Now we should get inside. Tomorrow's a full day. We've got those letters to write and that negotiation with Patterson." As Clara stood to go in, she impulsively touched his shoulder. "Thank you for everything, for being nothing like I expected." "Could say the same about you, Boston," he said, using what would become his pet name for her. "Could say the same about you." The next weeks fell into a rhythm. Clara rose early, though never as early as Jonah, and after breakfast she'd work on the books while he handled the ranch operations. In the afternoons, she'd help Mrs. Henderson with household tasks, learning the practical skills her Boston education had never taught: how to make bread, preserve vegetables, mend clothes for hardware. Twice a week, Jonah would take her out on the ranch, teaching her to ride. She'd only ever ridden side saddle in Boston's parks, and learning to ride astride in split skirts was a revelation of freedom. He taught her to read the weather in the clouds, to identify the different grasses, to understand which cows were healthy and which needed attention. "You're a natural," he told her one afternoon as she helped him move a small herd to fresh pasture. "Most city folk take months to get comfortable around cattle." "They're not so different from my students," Clara laughed. Stubborn, prone to wandering off, and responsive to a firm but kind hand. The comparison made him laugh, a rich sound she was hearing more often. Evenings were her favorite time. After supper, they'd sit in the main room, Jonah working on harness repairs or reading week-old newspapers from town, Clara writing letters or reading from Jonah's small but treasured collection of books. Sometimes they'd talk about the ranch's future, about new breeding stock, or the possibility of a railroad spur coming through. Sometimes they'd share stories from their pasts, Jonah talking about his childhood in Texas, Clara describing Boston's bustle and culture. "Do you miss it?" he asked one evening. "The concerts, the lectures, all that civilization," Clara considered. "I miss parts of it. I miss having other women to talk to." "Mrs. Henderson's wonderful, but she'll be leaving soon. I miss having access to books, to news, but..." She paused, trying to articulate something she'd only recently understood. "I don't miss who I had to be there. Every word measured, every action scrutinized. Here I can just be." There's a lending library in town, Jonah offered. Mrs. Patterson runs it out of her parlor, and there's talk of starting a school. They'd need a teacher. Clara's heart jumped at the possibility, but then reality crashed back. They wouldn't want me if they knew. They don't need to know anything except that you're qualified and willing, Jonah said firmly. Your past is your business, Clara. Nobody else's. A few days later, they made the trip to town together. Clara wore one of Sarah's dresses, practical brown wool that wouldn't show the dust, and tried to calm her nerves as they approached the general store. This would be her first real test as a member of the community. Patterson's general store dominated Main Street, a two-story building that sold everything from flour to farm equipment. Mr. Patterson himself was a thin, sharp-faced man who looked at Clara with obvious curiosity. "This is Miss Whitmore," Jonah said simply. "She's handling my accounts now." "That's so." Patterson's eyes narrowed. "No offense, miss, but ranching accounts are complex." "Indeed they are," Clara interrupted smoothly. "Which is why I was surprised to find several discrepancies in your billing. For instance, you charged Mr. McAllister for 50 pounds of flour in June, but your delivery receipt shows only 40. There are similar issues with the coffee sugar and ammunition orders." She produced the carefully prepared documentation, laying it out on the counter with precision. Patterson's face went from skeptical to defensive to resigned as she walked through each error. "Must have been clerical mistakes," he muttered. "I'm sure," Clara said pleasantly, "which is why I've prepared corrected invoices for the past 6 months. After you adjust the balance, Mr. McAllister will owe you." She made a show of calculating, though she knew the figure by heart, $17.32, rather than the $43 on your books. Patterson looked like he'd swallowed a lemon, but he couldn't argue with her figures. As he grudgingly made the corrections, Clara became aware of other customers watching, several ranch wives who'd stopped their shopping to observe this exchange. "Additionally," Clara continued, "going forward, we'll need itemized receipts for all deliveries signed by both your delivery man and someone at the ranch. I'm sure you'll agree that accurate record-keeping benefits everyone." "Of course," Patterson said through gritted teeth. As they left the store, Jonah fighting a smile, a woman approached them. She was perhaps 40, with a kind face and intelligent eyes. "Excuse me, Miss Whitmore, I'm Elizabeth Morgan. My husband owns the Double Bar Ranch north of yours. I couldn't help but overhear. Would you be willing to look at our accounts?" I've always suspected Patterson's arithmetic was creative, but I could never prove it. Clara glanced at Jonah, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd be happy to help, Mrs. Morgan. Please call me Elizabeth, and perhaps you join our sewing circle. We meet Thursday afternoons. We call it sewing, but mostly we gossip and eat cake." The olive branch was unexpected and precious. "I'd like that very much." As they drove home, the wagon loaded with correctly priced supplies, Jonah reached over and briefly squeezed her hand. "You were magnificent in there. Patterson's been overcharging ranchers for years, but nobody could ever pin him down." "It's just mathematics," Clara said, but she was glowing from the praise and the acceptance she'd felt from Elizabeth Morgan. "It's more than that. You stood up to him, made your case, and earned respect. That's no small thing." That night, Clara lay in her bed, Sarah's former sewing room converted to a guest room, and thought about the strange turns her life had taken. 3 months ago, she'd been a pariah in Boston, turned away from every door. Now she was building something new, something real. But more than that, she was beginning to feel something she'd never expected: attraction to the quiet rancher who'd taken her in. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the patient way he explained things, his hands gentle with animals and respectful with her. She pushed the thoughts away. This was a business arrangement, she reminded herself. Jonah had been clear about that. What she didn't know was that down the hall, Jonah lay awake having similar thoughts. Clara had brought life back to his home, her laughter, her quick wit, her fearlessness in taking on new challenges. He found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, to seeing her face light up when she mastered something new. But he'd promised her time, freedom to choose. He wouldn't pressure her, wouldn't assume anything, even if increasingly he hoped her choice would be to stay. The next Thursday, Clara attended the sewing circle at Elizabeth Morgan's ranch. She was nervous, knowing how quickly women's groups could turn cruel, but Elizabeth had prepared the way well. "Ladies, This is Clara Whitmore, who's managing Jonah McAllister's books and gave Patterson what for about his creative arithmetic. Clara, this is Margaret Stevens, Anne Crawford, and Dorothy Chen. Yes, before you ask, her husband is Chinese, and yes, we've all gotten over the scandal of it. Dorothy, a beautiful woman with mixed features that spoke of her dual heritage, smiled warmly. Welcome to the club of women who don't quite fit the mold, Miss Whitmore. Please call me Clara. And how did you all end up in Wyoming? Margaret laughed. She was older, perhaps 50, with silver streaking her dark hair. I was a saloon girl in Denver before I met my Robert. Anne here was a Confederate widow with no family left after the war. We're all refugees of one kind or another. What they're trying to say, Elizabeth added, pulling out a flask and adding a generous amount of whiskey to her tea, is that we don't much care about your past, but we're dying to know how you got Jonah McAllister to finally bring a woman home. Clara found herself relaxing, then laughing, then sharing more than she'd intended about her situation, though she kept the worst details private. The women listened, nodded, and offered their own stories of reinvention. Honey, Anne said finally, her southern accent still strong after years in the West. That man looks at you like you hung the moon. Whatever arrangement y'all started with, I'd bet good money it won't stay businesslike for long. He's been a perfect gentleman, Clara protested. Well, that's your first problem right there. Dorothy laughed. Sometimes a woman has to give a gentleman a little encouragement. Clara blushed furiously, but she left the gathering feeling lighter than she had in months. She had friends, or at least the beginning of friendships. She had a place in this community. When she got home, she found Jonah in the barn doctoring a cow's cut leg. Without thinking, she pitched in to help holding the animal steady while he cleaned and bandaged the wound. How was your sewing circle? He asked as they worked. Educational, Clara said dryly. I learned 3 new gossip stories, a remedy for removing ink stains, and that Dorothy Chen makes the strongest tea in Wyoming. That's because it's half whiskey. Jonah grinned. Did they interrogate you? Thoroughly, but kindly. They're good women. They are. I'm glad you're making friends here. As they finished with the cow and walked back toward the house, Clara gathered her courage. Jonah, can I ask you something? Always. Are you happy with our arrangement? Having me here, I mean. He stopped walking, turning to face her in the fading light. Clara, these past weeks have been... I didn't realize how lonely I'd been until you filled up all that empty space. You've brought order to my chaos, laughter, to my quiet, and... He paused, seeming to struggle with words. And yes, I'm happy with our arrangement. Are you... Yes, she said softly. Happier than I expected to be. Happier than I probably have a right to be. You have every right to happiness, Jonah said firmly. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise. They stood there, the space between them charged with possibility, but then Moses barked at something in the distance, breaking the spell. They continued to the house, both aware that something had shifted between them. That night, as had become their custom, they sat on the porch after supper. Mrs. Henderson had left the week before her chaperone duties deemed complete by local standards. Clara should have felt more awkward being alone with Jonah, but instead it felt natural, right? I've been thinking, Jonah said suddenly. Winter's coming in a few months. If you're planning to stay through winter, we'll need to get you proper clothing. The general store has some ready-made, but there's also a seamstress in town who could make you something fitted proper. The practical consideration touched her. He was thinking ahead, planning for her presence in his future. I'd like to stay through winter, Clara said carefully. If you'll have me. Clara. Jonah turned to her, his expression serious. I'll have you as long as you're willing to stay. Whether that's through winter or... He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, but the implication clear. The first snow came early that year, dusting the ranch in white just as October turned to November. Clara stood at the kitchen window, mesmerized by how the landscape transformed when Jonah appeared beside her with a cup of coffee. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, handing her the steaming mug. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and neither pulled away as quickly as they once might have. It's magical, Clara breathed. In Boston, snow meant soot-stained slush within hours. This is pure. Wait until January. You might not find it so magical when we're snowed in for weeks at a time. He paused, studying her profile. That doesn't frighten you. Clara turned to meet his eyes. Very little frightens me anymore, Jonah. Not after everything I've survived. The truth of it hung between them. Over the past 2 months, Clara had transformed from the desperate woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach into someone strong, capable, essential to the ranch's operations. She'd reorganized not just Jonah's books, but his entire business approach, negotiating better contracts with buyers, establishing relationships with other ranchers' wives who proved invaluable for information and support. I need to check the horses, Jonah said, but he didn't move. They stood there, shoulders nearly touching, watching the snowfall. Clara, Mr. McAllister. Tom's voice shattered the moment as he burst through the door. We got trouble. Rustlers hit the Morgans last night, took 30 head. Jonah's entire demeanor changed, hardening into something Clara had never seen before. How many men? 4, maybe 5. Sheriffs forming a posse. Wants every available man. Saddle Tempest. I'll get my rifle. Jonah was already moving, then stopped, looking back at Clara. You'll be safe here. Pete's staying to watch the ranch. You're going after armed rustlers. Fear clawed at Clara's throat. She'd lost so much already. The thought of losing Jonah too was unbearable. It's what neighbors do, he said simply. I'll be back by tomorrow night. Before she could think, Clara crossed the room and gripped his arm. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me, Jonah. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, warmth, maybe hope. I promise. Lock the doors after dark. Pete will be close if you need anything. Then he was gone, leaving Clara standing in the kitchen with her heart hammering and the terrible realization that somewhere in these past months Jonah McAllister had become far more than just her employer or even her friend. The next 24 hours were the longest of Clara's life. She threw herself into work balancing ledgers that were already balanced, writing letters that didn't need writing, cooking enough food for a small army. Pete, a quiet young man who usually deferred to her with almost painful shyness, checked in periodically, assuring her that rustler gangs rarely struck the same area twice in succession. Besides, he said, trying to comfort her, Mr. Jonah's about the best shot in the territory. He'll be fine, Miss Clara. But Clara couldn't shake her fear. As night fell, she found herself in Jonah's study, surrounded by the things that made him who he was. Agricultural journals he studied religiously, the Bible that had belonged to his father, a daguerreotype of Sarah that he kept on his desk. Clara studied the woman's face, pretty serene, everything Clara wasn't. I'm falling in love with your husband, she whispered to the photograph. I didn't mean to. I came here with nothing, expecting nothing, and he gave me everything. I hope you'd understand. She must have dozed in his chair because she woke to the sound of horses approaching. Dawn was breaking, painting the snow pink and gold. Clara flew to the door just as Jonah dismounted, dirty and exhausted, but whole. Did you catch them? She asked, drinking in the sight of him, reassuring herself he was real and safe. We did. They're on their way to Cheyenne for trial. He looked at her standing there in yesterday's dress, her hair unpinned, and something in his expression softened. Were you waiting up for me? I couldn't sleep. I was worried. They stood there in the doorway, snow beginning to fall again, and Jonah reached up to touch her cheek. Clara, you could have been killed, she interrupted, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. You could have been shot, and I never would have told you. She stopped, catching herself before she said too much. Told me what? His voice was gentle, his thumb still tracing her cheekbone. Clara's courage failed her. How grateful I am for everything you've done for me. Disappointment flickered across his features, but he nodded. You never need to be grateful to me, Clara. Everything you have here you've earned twice over. The moment passed, but something had changed between them. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling, and they both knew it. As November progressed, their relationship shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Jonah's hand would linger when he helped her with her coat. Clara would find excuses to bring him coffee in the barn, staying to talk while he worked. Their evening conversation stretched later and later, neither wanting to be the first to retire. The sewing circle noticed immediately. That man is courting you, Elizabeth announced during one Thursday gathering. Don't even try to deny it. We have an arrangement, Clara protested weakly. Oh, honey, Dorothy laughed. The only arrangement you two have is that you're both too stubborn to admit what everyone else can see. He's still in love with his wife, Clara said quietly, voicing her deepest fear. The room went silent. Then Margaret, the eldest of them, spoke gently. Clara, dear, loving someone who's gone and loving someone who's here aren't mutually exclusive. The heart has room for both. Trust me, I've been married 3 times, twice widowed, and my current husband knows he shares my heart with ghosts. It doesn't diminish what we have. That evening, Clara found herself studying Jonah across the dinner table, wondering if Margaret was right. He was explaining his plans for spring, his eyes alight with enthusiasm, and she realized with a start that he was including her in every aspect. We should consider never I anymore. You're assuming I'll still be here in spring, she said carefully. Jonah's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Won't you be? That depends. On what? Clara gathered her courage. On whether you want a bookkeeper or something more. The silence stretched between them taut as a bowstring. Finally, Jonah set down his fork and stood coming around the table to kneel beside her chair, an echo of a proposal, though he made no move to touch her. Clara Whitmore, he said quietly, I haven't wanted to pressure you. You came here under difficult circumstances, and I wanted you to choose freely without obligation. But if you're asking what I want you to stay. Not as my bookkeeper, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're here. I want to build this ranch with you, have children with you, grow old with you. But only if that's what you want too. Only if you can see a future here with me. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but for once they were tears of joy. I need to tell you something first. About William Hartley. About what really happened. You don't owe me. Please. I need you to know everything before you make this offer. She took a deep breath. He didn't just try to force himself on me. He'd been pursuing me for months, getting increasingly aggressive. That night he was drunk. He cornered me in the classroom, and when I refused him again, he said he'd ruin me either way, that if I didn't become his mistress, he'd make sure everyone thought I had. When he put his hands on me, when he tore my dress, I didn't just hit him with the paperweight, I hit him twice. The second time was after he was already down. I wanted to hurt him, Jonah. I wanted to make him pay for every humiliation, every fear. That's not very ladylike, is it? Jonah's jaw tightened. Sounds like self-defense to me. And if I ever meet William Hartley, I might have to show him what it feels like to be cornered by someone stronger. You don't think less of me for the violence. Clara. Jonah took her hands in his. I think you're the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known. You survived something terrible, you started over with nothing, and you've built yourself back up through sheer determination. How could I think less of you for that? Your wife would never have. Sarah was raised in comfort and safety. She never had to fight for anything, never had to prove her worth. I loved her, Clara, and I mourned her deeply. But she's gone, and you're here, and what I feel for you is different, but no less real. Sarah was my past. You, I hope, are my future. Clara searched his face, finding only sincerity and a warmth that made her heart race. Ask me again. What? Your question. Ask me again properly this time. Understanding dawned in Jonah's eyes, and he shifted to one knee, still holding her hands. Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? Not because you need to, not because it's practical, but because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much. You love me. The words came out as barely a whisper. I've been falling in love with you since the day you told Patterson his arithmetic was creative. Maybe even since you stepped off that stagecoach brave enough to face an uncertain future rather than give up. I love your courage, your intelligence, your kindness to everyone from Tom to Moses. I love how you've made this house a home again. I love you, Clara. The question is... Yes, Clara interrupted, laughing and crying simultaneously. Yes, Jonah McAllister, I'll marry you. Because I love you too. Because somewhere between learning to ride and arguing about cattle prices and sitting on that porch watching sunsets, I fell completely, irrevocably in love with you. Jonah rose, pulling her up with him, and kissed her for the first time. It was gentle, almost reverent, but with a promise of passion carefully banked. When they separated, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. How soon can we arrange a wedding? He asked. Well, Clara said, a smile playing at her lips. Elizabeth Morgan did say something about the circuit preacher being in town next Sunday. 6 days. I can wait 6 days. I've waited this long to find you. I can wait 6 more days. The announcement of their engagement sent ripples through the small community. Most were pleased the match made sense, and Clara had proven herself a valuable addition to the area. But there were some whispers, particularly from newer arrivals, who wondered about the propriety of the situation. These whispers reached a crescendo when Martha Blackwood, the banker's wife, who'd recently arrived from St. Louis, made a pointed comment at the general store about certain standards needing to be maintained even on the frontier. Clara, who was purchasing fabric for her wedding dress with Elizabeth and Dorothy's help, felt the familiar chill of social censure. But before she could respond, Dorothy Chen stepped forward. Mrs. Blackwood, are you referring to standards like marrying for love rather than money? Or perhaps the standard of judging people by their character rather than their circumstances? Because those are the standards we maintain here. I simply meant, Martha began, her face reddening. We know what you meant, Elizabeth interjected coolly. And you should know that Clara Whitmore has done more for this community in 3 months than most do in years. She's helped half the ranchers in the valley fix their accounts. She's organizing a winter school for the children, and she's marrying one of the finest men in Wyoming. If those aren't high enough standards for you, perhaps St. Louis would be more to your liking. Martha fled the store, and Clara found herself surrounded by women offering congratulations and fabric suggestions. The attempted snub had backfired, solidifying Clara's acceptance in the community. Thank you, she said to her friends later as they worked on her dress in Elizabeth's parlor. Honey, we protect our own, Margaret said expertly, hemming the blue fabric, not white, Clara had decided, because she wanted no reminders of who she'd been before. And you're one of us now. The night before the wedding, Clara couldn't sleep. She wandered the house that would officially become hers tomorrow, touching things that had become familiar. The rocking chair where she read in the evenings, the kitchen table where she'd spread out the ranch's books, the porch rail where she and Jonah had leaned while watching countless sunsets. She found him on the porch, despite the cold, wrapped in his heavy coat, looking out at the snow-covered land. Couldn't sleep either, she asked, joining him. Too much thinking, he admitted, wrapping his arm around her and pulling her against his warmth. Tomorrow changes everything. Are you having second thoughts? Never. You. Never. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I wrote to my cousins in Boston, told them I was getting married. Jonah tensed slightly. Do you want them to know where you are? No. I just wanted them to know I survived, that their dire predictions didn't come true, that I found something better than anything Boston could have offered me. And what's that? Clara turned in his arms to look up at him. Freedom, purpose, love, you. He kissed her then deeper than before, and Clara felt heat spread through her despite the winter cold. Tomorrow night, he said against her lips, his voice rough. You'll be my wife. I'm already yours, she whispered back. Tomorrow just makes it official. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the snow sparkling like diamonds under the winter sun. The small church was packed with ranchers and their families coming from miles around. Clara wore her blue dress with Sarah's cameo at her throat. Jonah had given it to her that morning, saying Sarah would have wanted her to have it. Tom walked her down the aisle, gruff and emotional, having appointed himself her surrogate father for the occasion. Pete stood as Jonah's best man, and Elizabeth Morgan served as Clara's matron of honor. Moses had been firmly told to stay outside, but could be heard occasionally whining at the door. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, there was a long silence. Then old Tom spoke up from his position beside Clara. I got something to say, he announced, and Clara's heart stopped. This here girl came to us a stranger, but she's become family. And Jonah, there's been like a son to me these 8 years. Seeing them together, seeing how they've brought out the best in each other, well, anyone who'd object to that would have to go through me first. A murmur of agreement ran through the congregation, and Clara blinked back tears. The ceremony continued, and when Jonah said his vows, his voice was strong and clear. Clara, you came into my life when I'd forgotten how to hope. You've made me laugh again, dream again, believe in the future again. I promise to cherish you, protect you, and love you with everything I have for all the days of my life." Clara's voice trembled with emotion as she spoke her own vows. "Jonah, you gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go. But more than that, you gave me respect, partnership, and love. You saw past my circumstances to who I really am. I promise to stand beside you, work alongside you, and love you through whatever comes until my last breath." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Jonah kissed her in front of the whole community, the church erupted in applause. Even Martha Blackwood, seated in the back, dabbed at her eyes. The reception was held at the ranch with neighbors bringing food and music. Clara danced with Jonah, with Tom, with Pete, even with Moses, who'd finally been allowed inside and seemed determined to celebrate in his own way. As the sun set, painting the snow-covered mountains pink and gold, Jonah pulled her aside. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Clara said. Then laughed. Who would have thought that answering a newspaper advertisement would lead to this? "I knew," Jonah said, spinning her around. "The moment I saw you step off that coach crying and brave and beautiful, I knew you were going to change everything. You didn't mind the crying. It told me you were real, that you'd been hurt but hadn't let it break you, that you were strong enough for this life but still soft enough to feel." He pulled her closer. "I fell in love with you in that moment, Clara McAllister, even if it took me months to admit it." The use of her new name sent a thrill through her. Clara McAllister. She'd been so many things proper. Boston lady, ruined woman, desperate mail-order bride, efficient bookkeeper. But now she was simply Clara McAllister, rancher's wife, and that felt more right than anything ever had. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, calling out good wishes and sly jokes that made Clara blush, she and Jonah stood on their porch watching the wagons disappear into the darkness. "Ready to go inside, Mrs. McAllister?" Jonah asked, his voice low and full of promise. Clara looked up at him. This man who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved, and smiled. "I've been ready since the day I arrived." He swept her up in his arms, carrying her over the threshold, despite her laughing protests, and Moses barked approvingly from the porch. Their wedding night was tender and passionate by turns, a culmination of months of growing love and desire. Clara discovered that the marriage bed approached with love and respect held none of the terror that William Hartley had tried to force upon her. Instead, she found joy, connection, and a physical expression of the emotional bond she and Jonah had built. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the bed that was now theirs to share, Jonah traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming, maybe in all of America. Because you got a bookkeeper and a wife for the price of one." He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Because I got Clara, just Clara. That's worth more than all the cattle in Texas." Winter settled over the ranch with a vengeance after the wedding, but Clara had never been happier. The house that had felt like a refuge became a true home. She and Jonah fell into the rhythms of married life with surprising ease, as if they'd been together for years rather than months. The work was hard. Winter meant constant vigilance over the cattle-breaking ice, on water troughs, hauling feed through deep snow. Clara learned to help with everything from birthing calves to mending harnesses. Her hands, once soft from holding only pens and books, became strong and capable. But there were quiet moments, 2 long evenings by the fire, Jonah reading aloud while Clara knitted, a skill taught by the patient Elizabeth Morgan, or Clara playing the small piano Jonah surprised her with for Christmas, ordered from Denver at considerable expense. "You shouldn't have spent so much," she'd protested, even as her fingers lovingly traced the keys. "A house needs music," he'd replied simply, "and I need to hear you play." She played the songs she'd learned in Boston, teaching Jonah the words to proper ballads and being scandalized when he taught her the Cowboy's considerably less proper versions. Their laughter filled the house, warming it more than any fire could. In January, during a brief thaw, they received an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed man on an expensive horse rode up to the house, and Clara's blood ran cold when she recognized him. Richard Hartley, William's younger brother. "Clara Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat mockingly. "Or should I say, Mrs. McAllister, news of your marriage reached Boston. William was most interested to hear it." Jonah emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, having heard the stranger's horse. "You're on my property, friend. State your business." Richard's eyes flicked between them, and his smile was unpleasant. "I'm here to deliver a message to your wife. You see, there are certain matters that were left unresolved when she fled Boston." "She didn't flee anywhere," Jonah said quietly, but Clara heard the danger in his tone. "She came here to start a new life, which is her right as a free woman." "Perhaps, but William feels differently. He's prepared to bring charges against her for assault. The statute of limitations hasn't expired, you see. Unless, of course, she'd prefer to come to a different arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite her internal terror. "William has business interests expanding westward. It would be useful to have connections here. Your husband's ranch, for instance, would make an excellent way station for our cattle operations." "You're trying to blackmail us," Jonah said flatly. "Such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as a business proposition." Clara stepped forward, surprising both men. "Tell William this. If he wants to bring charges, he's welcome to try. But he might want to consider what would come out in a trial, how he cornered me alone after hours, how he'd been harassing me for months with witnesses who saw his behavior, how he tore my dress, left bruises on my arms. I kept that dress, by the way. I kept the letters he sent increasingly threatening when I refused him. Did he mention those letters to you, Mr. Hartley?" Richard's confident expression faltered slightly. "Furthermore," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength, "my husband is well respected here. The territorial judge is a personal friend. The sheriff, too. We have a community that knows my character and would testify on my behalf. Does William really want his behavior exposed in open court? Does your family want that kind of publicity? Because I assure you the newspapers here would find it a fascinating story. Wealthy Boston man tries to force himself on innocent schoolteacher, then attempts to ruin her when she defends herself." "You're bluffing. You don't have those letters." Clara smiled coldly. "Would you like to stake your family's reputation on that assumption?" Richard looked between them, clearly reassessing. Jonah moved to stand beside his wife, the rifle still prominently displayed. "I think you should leave now," Jonah said calmly, "and tell William Hartley that if he or anyone else from his family comes near my wife again, they'll answer to me. And unlike Clara, I won't stop at a paperweight." Richard wheeled his horse around but called back, "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Clara called after him. "Tell William I'm happy now. Happier than I ever could have been as his mistress or anyone else's in Boston. Tell him I won, Mr. Hartley. Despite everything he tried to do to me, I won." After Richard disappeared over the ridge, Clara collapsed against Jonah, shaking. "Did you really keep those letters?" he asked, holding her tight. "Everyone. They're in a safe deposit box in Boston in my cousin's name. I knew someday I might need them." "You brilliant, brave woman." He kissed the top of her head. "Do you think he'll leave us alone?" "I think William Hartley is a coward who only attacks those he perceives as weak. Now that he knows I have weapons to fight back and a husband willing to protect me, he'll slink back to Boston and pretend I never existed." She was right. They never heard from the Hartleys again. And though months later Elizabeth Morgan mentioned hearing through her Eastern connections that William Hartley had married a railroad heiress and moved to New York, apparently eager to leave Boston behind. As winter gave way to spring, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for weeks, but waited to be certain before telling Jonah. She chose a Sunday morning when they were lingering over breakfast with nowhere urgent to be. "Jonah," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach, "we're going to need to expand the house again." He looked confused for a moment, then his eyes widened with understanding and wonder. "Clara, are we? Sometime in October, I think. I'll need to see Doc Morrison to be sure, but all the signs are there." Jonah was around the table in an instant, lifting her out of her chair and spinning her around, both of them laughing and crying. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." "You're not disappointed it's so soon?" "Disappointed, Clara? I thought after Sarah, the doctor said it was something about me that I might not be able to father children. You've given me another miracle." They stood there in their kitchen, holding each other as the spring sun streamed through windows that Clara had hung with the curtains she'd made over the winter. Outside, Moses barked at something, probably a rabbit. The cattle lowed in the distance. Life went on around them, but in that moment their world had shifted again, expanded to make room for the future they were creating together. "I love you, Jonah McAllister," Clara said against his chest. "And I love you, Clara McAllister. You and our baby and this life we're building." That afternoon they walked their land together, making plans. Where to put the addition for the nursery, how to manage the ranch work, when Clara was further along names they might choose. Jonah was already talking about teaching their child to ride, while Clara insisted on education coming first. "They can learn both," Jonah laughed. "Ride in the morning, read in the afternoon. And what if it's a girl? Then she'll learn both just the same. Any daughter of yours will be able to do anything she sets her mind to." Clara thought of the woman she'd been just 9 months ago, desperate ruin, seeing no future beyond survival. Now she stood on her own land beside her husband, carrying their child, surrounded by a community that had embraced her. The spring roundup was in full swing when Clara first felt the baby move. She was standing at the corral fence watching Jonah and the hands work the cattle when the flutter came soft as butterfly wings but unmistakable. She pressed her hand to the small swell of her belly, tears springing to her eyes. "You all right, Miss Clara?" Pete called out, noticing her expression from where he was branding a calf. "More than all right," she called back, laughing through her tears. "The baby just said hello." Jonah was off his horse, and at her side in seconds, his face bright with excitement. "You felt it. The baby moved. Just a flutter, but yes." She took his hand, pressing it against her stomach. "Wait, there. Did you feel that?" His face transformed with wonder, and for a moment the tough rancher who'd faced down rustlers and survived frontier hardships looked like a young boy on Christmas morning. The other hands politely turned away, giving them their moment, though Clara caught Tom wiping his eyes with his sleeve. As spring mellowed into summer, Clara's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though she chafed at the restrictions it placed on her. Doc Morrison, a kindly man in his 60s who'd delivered half the babies in the territory, insisted she avoid riding and heavy work. "But I feel fine," Clara protested during one of his visits. "And we want to keep it that way," the doctor said firmly. "You're not 20 anymore, Mrs. McAllister, and first babies after 30 need extra care." "I'm only 27? Clara protested. "Even so, let that husband of yours spoil you a little. Lord knows he's eager enough to do it." It was true. Jonah had become almost comically protective, hiring a young woman from town to help with household chores despite Clara's protests that she could manage. "Jenny needs the work," he argued, referring to the girl whose father had died in a mining accident. "And you need the rest." Clara found an unexpected friend in Jenny, who at 17 was eager to learn everything Clara could teach her about running a household and keeping books. The girl had a quick mind and reminded Clara of some of her brightest students in Boston. "Maybe you should be the teacher when the school opens," Jenny said one afternoon as they worked on preserving early berries. "The school board hasn't approved it yet," Clara said, though she'd been working with Elizabeth and the other ranchers' wives to establish a proper school for the area's children. "They will. Mrs. Morgan says you're the most qualified person in 300 miles. The school debate had indeed become a significant issue in the community. While most families wanted their children educated, there was disagreement about who should teach. Martha Blackwood, still smarting from her earlier social defeat, had put forward her niece from St. Louis. "She has impeccable credentials," Martha argued at the town meeting in June, "educated at a finishing school with experience teaching in proper establishments." "We don't need finishing school manners out here," Elizabeth countered. "We need someone who understands our life, our challenges. Clara McAllister has proven herself part of this community." "But she's expecting," Martha said with false concern. "Surely it wouldn't be appropriate." "I could teach until October and resume after the baby's born," Clara interjected, standing, despite Jonah's attempt to keep her seated. "Many teachers back east do exactly that, and I've already prepared a curriculum adapted to frontier needs practical mathematics for ranch management reading that includes agricultural journals alongside classic science focused on weather patterns and animal husbandry." The room buzzed with interest. Several ranchers who'd benefited from Clara's help with their books spoke up in support. The woman saved me $300 in bad contracts, called out Jim Stevens. I trust her to teach my boys. She taught my Maria to read in just 2 months of Sunday visits, added Miguel Rodriguez, one of the Mexican-American ranchers from the Southern Valley. My daughter reads better than I do now. When the vote came, it wasn't even close. Clara would be Willow Creek's first official school teacher starting in September if her health allowed, and resuming the following spring after the baby came. Walking home from the meeting, Jonah's arm around her expanding waist, Clara felt a deep satisfaction. "You've conquered them all," he said proudly. "Even Martha Blackwood voted for you in the end." She had to after everyone else did. "But Jonah, what if the baby comes early? What if I can't?" "Then Jenny or Elizabeth will fill in until you can. Stop borrowing trouble, Boston. You've got a whole community behind you now." As July brought scorching heat that made Clara grateful for the enforced rest, an unexpected letter arrived that threatened to shatter their hard-won peace. It was from her cousin Louise in Boston, the only family member who'd shown her any kindness during her scandal. "My dear Clara," the letter began, "I was overjoyed to receive word of your marriage and current happiness. However, I write with some urgency to warn you. William Hartley has suffered a severe financial reversal, some failed speculation in railroad stocks. In his desperation and bitterness, he's been making threats about pursuing that old matter with you. His brother Richard apparently told him of your husband's prosperity, and William seems to think he might extract some financial settlement. I wanted you to be prepared. Your loving cousin Louise." Clara's hand shook as she showed the letter to Jonah that evening. He read it twice, his jaw tightening with each word. "He won't get within 100 miles of you," Jonah said flatly. "I'll wire the sheriff in Cheyenne, alert the territorial marshal. The man's a known coward. He won't risk coming here himself." But Clara knew William Hartley's type too well. Cowards could be dangerous when desperate, especially when they thought they had nothing left to lose. She spent the next weeks jumping at every unfamiliar horse that approached the ranch, every stranger in town. Her fears proved founded when in early August, she was at the general store with Jenny selecting fabric for baby clothes when a man in a cheap suit approached her. He had the look of a city lawyer fallen on hard times, shabby genteel, she'd heard it called. "Mrs. McAllister, my name is Cornelius Wade. I represent Mr. William Hartley in a matter of some delicacy." Clara's hand went protectively to her belly. Jenny, bless her, immediately moved closer, her young face fierce with loyalty. "Mr. Hartley has no business with me," Clara said coolly, though her heart was racing. "I'm afraid he disagrees. You see, there's the matter of an assault that was never properly adjudicated. Mr. Hartley is prepared to file formal charges unless some accommodation can be reached." "You mean, unless we pay him off," Clara said loudly enough for others in the store to hear. Several heads turned their way. Wade flushed. "I wouldn't put it so crudely. Mr. Hartley has suffered significant damages, physical and reputational. Compensation seems only fair." "Fair?" Clara's voice rose. "Fair would have been if William Hartley had faced charges for attempting to force himself on me. Fair would have been if my word had been believed over his lies. Fair would have been keeping my teaching position instead of being driven from Boston in shame for defending myself." By now half the store was listening. Mr. Patterson had even stopped tallying his accounts to watch. "Ma'am, perhaps we should discuss this privately," Wade began. "No," Clara said firmly. "You came here publicly to threaten me. You can hear my answer publicly. Tell William Hartley that I will never give him 1 cent. Tell him that if he wants to pursue charges, he's welcome to try. I have witnesses to his harassment. I have the letters he sent me promising to ruin me if I didn't become his mistress, and I have a torn dress with his blood on it from where I defended myself. Moreover, I have a husband and a community who will stand by me. You can't prove—" "Can't I?" Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a packet of letters she'd taken to carrying since Louise's warning arrived. "Would you like me to read them aloud? I'm sure everyone here would be fascinated to hear what the respectable William Hartley wrote to a young schoolteacher. This one's particularly interesting where he describes in detail what he planned to do to me." Wade went pale. "Those could be forgeries." "Then let a court decide. But I wonder what Boston society would think when these letters are published in the newspapers, and make no mistake, Mr. Wade, they will be published. Every sordid detail of William Hartley's attempted assault, on a defenseless woman. The store had gone completely silent. Then Tom's voice rang out from the back where he'd been purchasing ammunition. "This fellow bothering you, Miss Clara?" "I was just leaving," Wade said quickly, backing toward the door. But he stopped at the threshold trying to salvage some authority. "Mr. Hartley won't be pleased. He has resources, influence." "Had," Clara corrected. "From what I hear, he's lost most of his money and all of his credibility. He's a ruined man grasping at straws, sending a cut-rate lawyer to threaten a pregnant woman. Tell him to stay in Boston and be grateful I don't pursue charges against him for harassment and extortion." Wade fled, and the store erupted in supportive murmurs. Mrs. Patterson came around the counter to embrace Clara, while the men nodded approvingly. "Handled him like a boss mare handles an upstart colt," Tom said admiringly. When Clara got home and told Jonah what had happened, he was torn between pride in her strength and fury that she'd had to face it alone. "I should have been there," he said, pacing their bedroom as Clara sat on the bed exhausted from the confrontation. "I didn't need you there," Clara said gently. "That's the point, Jonah. A year ago I would have crumbled. I would have paid anything to make him go away. But now, I'm not that frightened woman anymore. I'm Clara McAllister, and I'm not afraid of William Hartley or anyone else." Jonah stopped pacing and knelt before her, taking her hands. "You're the strongest woman I know. But you don't have to be strong alone anymore. We're partners, remember. I know. And knowing you'd stand with me gave me the courage to stand up to Wade. But I needed to do it myself to prove that William Hartley has no power over me anymore." They never heard from Wade or William Hartley again. Years later, Clara would learn through Louise that William had drunk himself to death in a boarding house in New York alone and unmourned. But that August day was the last time his shadow would fall across her life. As summer waned and September brought cooler weather, Clara threw herself into preparing for the school's opening. The community had converted an old storage building into a one-room schoolhouse, with Jonah and the other ranchers providing lumber for desks and benches. Clara, despite her increasingly cumbersome pregnancy, supervised every detail. "You need to rest," Jonah said for the 100th time as he found her organizing books on newly built shelves. "I'll rest when it's ready," Clara replied, then gasped and grabbed her belly as a particularly strong kick nearly doubled her over. "Clara." Jonah was beside her, instantly supporting her weight. "I'm fine. The baby's just eager to join the preparations." She straightened, rubbing the spot where a tiny foot or elbow had jabbed her. "Only 6 more weeks." "Or less," Doc Morrison said when he examined her a few days later. "This baby's dropped already. Could come any time after the month's turn." The possibility both thrilled and terrified Clara. She'd helped with calving and foaling, but human birth was different, more dangerous. She'd heard the stories, knew the risks. Sarah McAllister had died in childbirth after all. Perhaps sensing her fears, Jonah became even more attentive. He moved his work closer to the house, had Tom or Pete constantly within shouting distance, and arranged for Mrs. Henderson to return from her daughter's ranch to stay with them as September turned to October. The school opened on September 15th with 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Clara, enormous with pregnancy, but determined, taught sitting down when necessary and relied on her older students to help with the younger ones. "Education is not just about books," she told them on that first day. "It's about understanding your world and finding your place in it. You'll learn to read and write and figure yes, but you'll also learn to think, to question, to solve problems. You'll learn skills that will serve you whether you become ranchers, merchants, or anything else you dream of being." Young Maria Rodriguez raised her hand. "Can girls be anything too, Mrs. McAllister?" "Girls can be anything they're brave enough to work for," Clara said firmly, thinking of her own journey. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The weeks passed in a blur of teaching, preparing for the baby, and managing what she could of the ranch books. Clara pushed herself perhaps harder than she should have, determined to establish the school properly before her confinement. On October 3rd, she taught a full day despite increasing back pain. That evening, as she served supper, her water broke in a dramatic gush that soaked her skirts and sent Jonah into a panic. "The baby, it's coming. Mrs. Henderson, Tom, somebody." "Jonah, calm down," Clara said, though she gripped the table as the first real contraction hit. "We have time. First babies take hours." But this baby, perhaps taking after its determined mother, had other ideas. The contractions came fast and hard, barely giving Clara time to breathe between them. Doc Morrison, summoned by a frantic Pete, arrived to find Clara already pushing Jonah pale as death beside her, and Mrs. Henderson calmly managing everything. "Well, this little one's in a hurry," the doctor said, quickly assessing the situation. "Clara, next contraction, you push hard as you can." The pain was beyond anything Clara had imagined, but she focused on Jonah's eyes, on his voice, telling her she was strong. She could do this. He loved her. And then, after what felt like hours, but was actually less than one, a baby's cry filled the room. "It's a girl," Doc Morrison announced, placing the squalling infant on Clara's chest. A healthy, perfect girl. Clara looked down at her daughter, red-faced, wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair like Jonah's, and fell completely in love. Jonah's tears dripped onto both of them as he leaned over, one hand on the baby, one on Clara. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "just like her mother." "What will you name her?" Mrs. Henderson asked efficiently, cleaning up, while the doctor tended to Clara. Clara and Jonah looked at each other. They'd discussed names for months, but hadn't decided. "Hope," Clara said suddenly. "Hope Sarah McAllister. For the hope that brought us together and the woman who loved you first." Jonah's voice was thick with emotion. "Hope. It's perfect." The news of Hope's birth spread quickly through the valley. By the next day, gifts began arriving: knitted blankets, carved toys, preserved foods for the exhausted parents. The entire community, it seemed, wanted to welcome this child, who represented so much new beginnings, the future of their frontier town, the triumph of love over adversity. Elizabeth Morgan was one of the first visitors, bringing a beautiful quilt she'd been secretly working on for months. "She's going to be something special," Elizabeth said, watching Hope nurse. "I can tell. She's got your spirit and Jonah's steadiness. This child will move mountains." "Right now I'd settle for her sleeping more than 2 hours at a time." Clara laughed tiredly. But despite the exhaustion, the endless feeding and changing and soothing, Clara had never been happier. Watching Jonah hold their daughter, seeing his large, work-roughened hands, gentle as he cradled her tiny form, filled her with a contentment she'd never imagined possible. 2 weeks after Hope's birth, on a crisp October morning with the aspens golden on the mountainsides, Clara sat on the porch in her rocking chair, the baby at her breast, when she saw riders approaching. Her body tensed. Unexpected visitors still made her nervous, but then she recognized the lead rider. It was her cousin Louise from Boston. "Louise?" Clara stood carefully, Hope protesting the interruption to her meal. "What are you doing here?" Louise dismounted, travel-worn but smiling, and embraced Clara carefully. "I came to meet your daughter and see this life you've built. I hope you don't mind I brought someone with me." The second rider dismounted, and Clara gasped. It was Mrs. Elmwood, her former employer from the school, the woman who'd been forced to dismiss her. "Clara, my dear," the older woman said, tears in her eyes. "I've come to apologize and to bring you something." She pulled a packet from her saddlebag. "These are testimonials from your former students and their parents. After you left, after the truth about William Hartley began to come out, he assaulted another woman, you see, and this time there were witnesses. People began to speak up. These letters clear your name completely." Clara took the packet with trembling hands. "The truth came out." "Eventually it always does," Mrs. Elmwood said. "Hartley's dead now, drank himself to death, but before he died he was exposed for what he was. These letters are your vindication should you ever need them." Clara looked at the packet, then at Hope in her arms, then at Jonah, who'd come from the barn to stand supportively beside her. "Thank you," she said to Mrs. Elmwood. "But I don't need vindication anymore. I have everything I need right here." Louise stayed for a week, marveling at Clara's transformation and falling in love with the frontier life. Mrs. Elmwood stayed only 2 days long enough to see Clara teaching in the little schoolhouse, Hope sleeping in a cradle beside her desk. "You've become who you were always meant to be," the older woman said as she prepared to leave. "That finishing school polish is still there, but now it's backed by steel. Your students here are lucky to have you." After the visitors left, life settled into new rhythms. Clara returned to teaching when Hope was 6 weeks old, bringing the baby with her and nursing between lessons. The students adored having a baby in the classroom, and the older girls took turns helping with her care. Winter came early that year, but Clara no longer feared it. The house was warm and full of laughter. Hope grew round and rosy, beginning to smile and coo charming everyone who met her. The ranch prospered under Clara and Jonah's joint management, and they began making plans for expansion: more cattle, perhaps horses, and definitely more children. "I want Hope to have siblings," Clara said one snowy evening as they sat by the fire, the baby sleeping in her cradle. "I want this house full of children." "So do I," Jonah agreed, pulling her closer. "Though maybe we could wait a little while for the next one. Let me recover from Hope's dramatic arrival first." Clara laughed. "You need to recover. I'm the one who did all the work." "And you were magnificent," he said, kissing her temple. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Only a dozen times." "Then I'm behind schedule." "I love you, Clara McAllister. I love our life, our daughter, our future. I love that you stood up to William Hartley's lawyer in the general store. I love that you're teaching the next generation of ranchers and merchants and maybe even teachers. I love that you took a chance on a newspaper advertisement and a lonely rancher who'd forgotten how to hope." Clara turned in his arms to kiss him properly. "And I love that you saw past a crying, desperate woman to someone worth taking a chance on. You saved me, Jonah." "We saved each other," he corrected. "That's what partners do." As the winter deepened, Clara received one more letter from Boston. This one from Louise, reporting that Clara's story had become something of a legend among the city's progressive women. The teacher who'd fought off an attacker refused to be silenced and found happiness in the untamed West. "You've become a symbol," Louise wrote. "Women here speak of pulling a Clara, standing up for themselves, refusing to accept society's judgment, making their own way." Clara read the letter aloud to Jonah, who grinned. "My wife the legend?" "Hardly. I'm just a rancher's wife and a school teacher." "You're never just anything, Boston. You're extraordinary, and someday Hope will know that her mother was a woman who refused to be broken, who built a new life from ashes, who showed an entire community what courage looks like." That spring, as the snow melted and the prairie burst into bloom, Clara stood in her classroom teaching the multiplication tables while Hope played in a pen Jonah had built in the corner. Through the window, she could see the ranch, their cattle grazing on new grass, Jonah and Tom working on breaking a new horse. Maria Rodriguez raised her hand. "Mrs. McAllister, my papa says you came here from a big city back east. Do you miss it?" Clara considered the question, thinking of Boston's grand buildings and cultural refinements, its strict social rules and harsh judgments. Then she looked at her students, ranch children with dirt under their nails and dreams in their eyes. She looked at Hope, babbling happily with a wooden horse Pete had carved for her. She thought of Jonah, who'd be coming to walk them home for lunch soon, probably with Moses trailing behind. "No, Maria," she said with complete honesty. "I don't miss it at all. Everything I could ever want is right here." The door opened and Jonah appeared as if her thoughts had summoned him. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought my girls might like to know that Buttercup just had her foal. A little filly, if anyone's interested in seeing her." The classroom erupted in excitement, and Clara gave in to the inevitable dismissing class early so they could all go see the new foal. As they walked toward the barn, Jonah carrying Hope, while Clara tried to maintain some semblance of order among her excited students, she thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach over a year ago, terrified, desperate, with nothing but a single valise and a terrible secret. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone stronger, happier, more complete. Clara McAllister had been forged in the crucible of scandal and adversity, tempered by love and acceptance, and polished by the harsh beauty of frontier life. "What are you thinking about?" Jonah asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "Beginnings," Clara said, taking his free hand. "And how sometimes what seems like an ending is really just the start of something better. Like us. Exactly like us." They reached the barn where the students were already cooing over the wobbly-legged foal. Hope reached out her chubby hands, trying to grab the air in the foal's direction, making everyone laugh. Tom was explaining to the children about how to approach horses gently, while Pete demonstrated the proper way to offer a flat palm for the mother horse to sniff. This was her family, Clara realized, not just Jonah and Hope, but all of them. Tom, who'd walked her down the aisle. Pete, who'd become like a younger brother. Elizabeth and Dorothy, and the other ranch wives who'd embraced her. Her students who looked at her with respect and affection. Even Moses, who was currently trying to herd the excited children into some sort of order. A year and a half ago, she'd lost everything, her position, her reputation, her future. But in losing everything, she'd found what really mattered. She'd found home. Mrs. McAllister. Young Timothy Crawford tugged at her skirt. Will you teach us about horses in science class? Of course, Clara said, ruffling his hair. We'll learn about horses and cattle and all the animals that make ranch life possible. And about the stars, Maria added hopefully. Papa says you know all their names. And the stars, Clara agreed. Everything you want to learn, we'll explore together. As the sun climbed higher in the endless Wyoming sky, Clara stood surrounded by her students, her husband, and their daughter, watching new life take its first tentative steps in the spring sunshine. The woman who'd fled Boston in shame had become the woman who stood at the heart of her community, teaching, nurturing, building the future one child, one lesson, one day at a time. That evening, after Hope was asleep and the house was quiet, Clara sat at her desk writing in the journal she'd started keeping. Jonah was already in bed waiting for her, but she wanted to capture this feeling, this moment. Today I realized that redemption isn't about erasing the past, she wrote. It's about transforming it into something useful, something that makes you stronger. Every tear I shed, every moment of despair, every fear I faced, they all led me here to this life I couldn't have imagined when I was safe and comfortable in Boston. She paused, thinking of the young women in Boston who might be facing their own William Hartleys, their own impossible choices. If I could tell them anything, she continued writing, I would say this: be brave enough to leave what's killing you even if you don't know what comes next. Take the chance, make the leap, answer the advertisement. Sometimes the biggest risk is staying where you are, and sometimes a stranger's kindness can save your life. She set down her pen and made her way to their bedroom, where Jonah was reading by lamplight. He looked up as she entered, setting his book aside immediately, and Clara felt that familiar flutter in her chest that his attention always brought. Hope's definitely asleep, he asked, pulling back the quilts for her. Dead to the world. She wore herself out trying to grab that fold today. Clara slipped into bed beside him, sighing contentedly as his arms came around her. The students want me to teach them about animal husbandry now. You'll have them running their own ranches before they're 15. Jonah chuckled, his breath warm against her hair. Would that be so terrible? Maria Rodriguez has a better head for numbers than half the grown men in this valley. And Timothy Crawford understands weather patterns better than farmers twice his age. You're building something important with that school, Jonah said seriously. These children will have opportunities their parents never dreamed of because of you. Before Clara could respond, Hope's cry pierced the night. Clara started to rise, but Jonah pressed her back down gently. I'll get her. You've been up with her the past 3 nights. Clara listened as Jonah soothed their daughter, his deep voice humming a lullaby she'd taught him one her own mother had sung years ago in Boston. It seemed like another lifetime, that childhood in Beacon Hill's elegant brownstones. Yet here in a ranch house on the Wyoming prairie, listening to her husband comfort their child, Clara felt more at home than she ever had in those supposedly refined surroundings. The next morning brought unexpected drama. Clara was preparing breakfast when Tom burst through the door without knocking, something he'd never done before. Jonah? Mrs. Clara. We got trouble. The Hendersons' place is on fire. The Henderson Ranch was 5 miles north, run by a young couple who'd arrived the previous year. Jonah was pulling on his boots before Tom finished speaking. How bad? Jonah asked. Bad. Wind's pushing it toward their barn. They're trying to save the livestock, but they need help. Clara, can you manage here? Jonah was already reaching for his rifle habit from years of frontier caution. Go, Clara said, though fear clenched her stomach. Prairie fires could spread for miles, consuming everything in their path. I'll prepare food and medical supplies. They'll need both when this is over. Within minutes, Jonah, Tom, and Pete were racing toward the smoke column rising black against the morning sky. Clara watched them go, then turned to see Jenny arriving for her daily help with Hope. Did you see the smoke? Jenny asked, breathless from running. The Henderson place. Here, help me pack supplies. They'll need everything we can spare. For the next hours, Clara and Jenny worked with efficient urgency, preparing bandages from clean cloth packing food that wouldn't spoil, gathering spare blankets and clothes. Hope, sensing the tension, was fussy, but Clara strapped her to her chest in a sling Dorothy Chen had taught her to make, freeing her hands for work. Elizabeth Morgan arrived around noon, her wagon loaded with supplies from her own ranch. "The fire's contained," she reported, and Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. "But the Hendersons lost their house and most of the barn. No one was badly hurt, thank God, but they've lost almost everything." "We'll take them in," Clara said immediately. "We have room," Elizabeth smiled. "I knew you'd say that. I've already told Alice Henderson you would. She's in my wagon, smoke, inhalation, and shock. Their boy Jimmy's with her." Clara hurried outside to find Alice Henderson, barely 22 years old, sitting in Elizabeth's wagon, clutching her 3-year-old son, both covered in soot and ash. Alice's eyes were vacant with shock, her hands trembling as she held Jimmy. "Alice," Clara said gently, helping her down from the wagon, "you're safe now. Come inside. We'll get you cleaned up and fed." "It's all gone," Alice whispered. "Everything we worked for. Dan built that house with his own hands, board by board, and now—" "And he'll build another," Clara said firmly, guiding the younger woman inside. "That's what we do out here. We rebuild. We survive. We help each other." As Clara bathed Jimmy and got him settled for a nap, she remembered her own arrival in Wyoming, desperate with nothing but a valise and the clothes on her back. The community had embraced her then. Now it was her turn to extend that same grace. By evening, the men returned exhausted and filthy but triumphant. The fire had been stopped before it could spread to neighboring ranches, though the Henderson property was a total loss. Dan Henderson, a stocky man in his late 20s, looked defeated as he sat at Clara's kitchen table, mechanically eating the stew she'd placed before him. "We put everything into that place," he said dully. "Every penny, every dream." "I know what it's like to lose everything," Clara said, sitting across from him while Alice slept upstairs with Jimmy. "When I came here, I had $16 to my name and a reputation destroyed by lies. I thought my life was over." Dan looked up surprised. He and Alice had arrived after Clara's marriage to Jonah, knowing her only as the respected schoolteacher and successful rancher's wife. "But look around," Clara continued. "This home, this life, this community, it all grew from ashes. Literal ashes in your case, but you'll rebuild. And we'll all help." Jonah nodded. "We'll organize a barn raising. Everyone will contribute what they can, lumber, labor, supplies. That's how it works out here." "But winter's coming," Dan protested. "We can't impose—" "It's not imposing," Tom interrupted from where he leaned against the doorframe. "It's neighboring. You do the same for us." And it was true. Over the next weeks, the entire valley mobilized to help the Hendersons. Clara organized the women to gather household goods, dishes, linens, clothes. The men pooled resources for lumber and tools. Even the children contributed, with Clara's students voting to use their planned Christmas party funds to buy seeds for the Hendersons' spring planting. Alice Henderson, recovering from her shock, was overwhelmed by the generosity. "In Ohio, where we came from, neighbors barely spoke to each other," she told Clara one evening as they worked together on quilts for the new house. "Here, people who barely know us are giving up their Sundays to rebuild our home." "That's the frontier," Clara said. "We can't survive alone, so we survive together. You'll have your chance to pay it forward someday." The barn raising took place on a crisp October Saturday, 2 weeks before Hope's first birthday. The entire community gathered at dawn on the Henderson property, where the cleared land still smelled faintly of smoke. By sunset, a new barn stood against the sky, smaller than the original but sturdy and sound. Clara, with Hope on her hip and her students helping serve food to the workers, watched Dan Henderson try to thank everyone, his voice breaking with emotion. "No thanks needed," Jonah said, clapping the younger man on the shoulder. "Just be ready to help when the next person needs it." That night, as Clara nursed Hope before bed, she reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. The frightened woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach would never have imagined herself as a pillar of the community, someone others turned to for help and guidance. "You're thinking too loud," Jonah said from the doorway, smiling at the picture they made Clara in her nightgown, Hope drowsing at her breast. "I was thinking about circles," Clara said, "how kindness comes around. Elizabeth and Dorothy took me in when I was a stranger. Now I can do the same for Alice. Someday she'll help someone else. It keeps going. Like ripples in a pond." Jonah agreed, sitting beside them on the bed. He traced a gentle finger down Hope's cheek. Our daughter will grow up understanding that thanks to you. Thanks to us, Wook, Clara corrected. You showed me what it meant to help without judgment, to give without expecting return. Hope had fallen asleep milk-drunk and content. Clara laid her in the cradle beside their bed, then turned to find Jonah watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken even after all this time. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. Just thinking how lucky I am, he said, pulling her into his arms. 2 years ago I was a lonely rancher with a successful spread and an empty heart. Now I have you. Hope a home full of laughter. And another baby on the way, Clara said quietly. Jonah pulled back to look at her face. What are you... Clara, are you sure? Pretty sure. I haven't seen Doc Morrison yet, but all the signs are there. I think around May. Jonah's whoop of joy woke Hope, who began crying indignantly. They laughed, taking turns soothing their daughter while exchanging delighted glances over her head. Another baby. Another miracle in their miraculous life. The news of Clara's pregnancy spread quickly, as news always did in their small community. Her students were particularly excited, already arguing over whether it would be a boy or girl and what they should name it. You should name him after a president, Timothy suggested seriously, like Abraham or George. What if it's a girl? Maria challenged. Then name her after Mrs. McAllister, Timothy said simply. Because she's the smartest, bravest lady in Wyoming. Clara had to turn away to hide her tears at that, pretending to organize papers while she composed herself. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year November, bringing blizzards that trapped everyone on their ranches for days at a time. The Hendersons, now living in their partially rebuilt house, were secure thanks to the community's efforts. Clara couldn't teach during the worst storms, but she sent lessons home with her students to work on trusting the older ones to help the younger. It was during one of these blizzards, the wind howling like wolves around the house, that unexpected visitors arrived. Clara was kneading bread, Hope playing at her feet with wooden blocks when Moses started barking frantically. Jonah, who'd been repairing harnesses by the fire, grabbed his rifle and went to the door. Through the swirling snow, they could barely make out a wagon with what looked like a whole family huddled in the back. Get them inside, Clara said immediately. They'll freeze to death out there. Jonah and Tom, who'd been staying in the bunkhouse during the storm, fought through the wind to help the strangers into the house. They turned out to be a colored family, parents and 3 children, all dangerously cold, and the youngest child barely conscious. Please, the woman gasped through chattering teeth. My baby! Clara didn't hesitate. Bring her here by the fire. Jenny, get blankets. Lots of them. The little girl, perhaps 4 years old, was hypothermic, her lips blue and her small body limp. Clara stripped off the child's frozen clothes and wrapped her in warm blankets, then held her close, sharing her own body heat, while the parents huddled with their other children near the fire. Thank you, the man said, his voice hoarse. We got lost in the storm. Thought we were done for. What are you doing out in this weather? Jonah asked, not unkindly, but with genuine concern. Running? The man said simply. We're been free since the war, but free don't mean safe in Kansas. Lynch mob came for our neighbor last week. Figured Wyoming might be better. Clara and Jonah exchanged glances. They'd heard stories of the violence in the post-war South and border states, but this was their first direct encounter with refugees from that terror. What's your name? Clara asked, still holding the warming child. Samuel Washington. This is my wife Ruth and our children Samuel Jr., Mary, and little Sarah. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Washington, you're safe here, Clara said firmly. This storm's not letting up for days, so you'll stay with us until it passes. Then we'll figure out what comes next. Some might have hesitated to take in a colored family, even in Wyoming, where the racial tensions weren't as sharp as elsewhere. But Clara remembered all too well what it felt like to be judged, rejected, nowhere to turn. And Jonah, she knew, judged people by their character, not their color. Over the next days, as the storm raged outside, the 2 families grew comfortable with each other. Ruth Washington was educated, had been a teacher herself before the war, and she and Clara found much in common. The children, after initial shyness, played together easily, as children do when adult prejudices haven't yet taken root. Samuel Washington was a skilled carpenter, and to repay their hospitality, fixed several things around the house that Jonah had been meaning to get to. But it was their stories shared during the long, storm-bound evenings that affected Clara most deeply. "We had our own farm," Ruth said one evening, helping Clara with the dinner dishes while the men talked cattle prices. Samuel's father earned enough to buy his freedom before the war, and Samuel was born free. "We thought after the war with slavery ended, things would get better." "But they got worse," Clara prompted gently. "Different. The Klan started rioting. Black folks who tried to vote or own land or get educated, they'd disappear, find them hanging from trees days later. When they burned the school where I taught, we knew it was time to leave." Clara thought of her own teaching, how she'd taken it for granted until it was ripped away from her. "You're a teacher without a school, and I'm a teacher with too many students. Perhaps we can solve both problems." Ruth looked at her with surprise and hope. "You'd let me teach alongside you, a colored woman?" "I'd welcome the help," Clara said. "And the children need to learn that knowledge and wisdom come in all colors." When the storm finally broke, revealing a world transformed by snow, the question arose of where the Washingtons would stay. The abandoned Murphy place 5 miles east had been sitting empty since the elderly owner died the previous year with no heirs. "It needs work," Jonah said, "but it's solid. Roof's Goodwill works. We could talk to the bank about you taking it over." "We don't have much money," Samuel said hesitantly. "You've got skills," Tom pointed out. "Carpentry work's always needed, and Mrs. Ruth could help with the teaching. Way I see it, you'd be doing us a favor taking on that property before it falls to ruin." It took some negotiating with the bank, and Clara suspected Jonah quietly guaranteed the loan, but within 2 weeks the Washingtons were installed in their new home. The community's reaction was mixed. Some welcomed them. Others were skeptical. A few were openly hostile. Martha Blackwood, predictably, was appalled. "It's not proper," she declared at the general store. "What will people think of our community?" "They'll think we're decent Christian folks who help those in need," Elizabeth Morgan said sharply. "Or would you prefer they think we're the kind of people who turn away families with young children to freeze in blizzards?" The matter was effectively settled when Clara brought Ruth Washington to the next school board meeting and proposed hiring her as an assistant teacher. "We have 18 students now, with more families moving in come spring," Clara argued. "I'm teaching 6 different grade levels while pregnant. I need help, and Mrs. Washington is qualified." "But the parents," one board member began, "can choose to keep their children home if they object," Clara said calmly. "But they'll be depriving them of education over prejudice. Is that the kind of community we want to be?" In the end, practicality won. Clara was obviously pregnant, would need time off when the baby came, and Ruth Washington was the only other qualified teacher for 100 miles. She would start after Christmas. The board decided on a trial basis. Christmas of 1875 was one Clara would always remember. The community gathered at the schoolhouse for a pageant the children had prepared. Maria Rodriguez played Mary Timothy Crawford, was Joseph, and little Sarah Washington, fully recovered from her near freeze, was an angel who forgot her lines but charmed everyone with her enthusiastic wing flapping. Hope, now 14 months old and toddling everywhere, tried repeatedly to join the performance, requiring Clara to scoop her up several times. The audience laughed good-naturedly, and Clara felt the baby inside her respond to the laughter with vigorous kicks. After the pageant, gifts were exchanged, mostly practical things like preserved food, knitted goods, and tools. But Jonah surprised Clara with something extraordinary. A piano, a real piano, shipped all the way from Denver. "Jonah McAllister," Clara gasped, running her hands over the polished wood. "This must have cost a fortune." "You're worth it," he said simply. "Besides, the children should learn music too. Culture, you called it. Can't have them growing up complete barbarians." Clara threw her arms around him, not caring that everyone was watching. "I love you," she whispered against his ear. "I love you too, Boston," he whispered back. "Merry Christmas." That night, after the guests had gone home and Hope was asleep, Clara played carols on her new piano while Jonah sang along in his rich baritone. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the world in peaceful white. 2 years ago, I spent Christmas alone in a boarding house, wondering if I'd survive the winter, Clara said softly, her fingers still moving over the keys. Now look at us indeed. Jonah agreed, his hand resting on her swelling belly. A family, a home, a community. Dreams I'd given up on all come true. The new year brought changes and challenges. Ruth Washington began teaching, and after initial resistance from a few families, her gentle manner and obvious competence won over most skeptics. The school grew to 22 students, with families moving to the area specifically because they'd heard about the quality of education available. Clara's pregnancy progressed well, though Doc Morrison insisted she reduce her activities as spring approached. She chafed at the restrictions, but admitted she tired more easily this time. "You're not 20 anymore," the doctor reminded her, echoing his words from her first pregnancy. "I'm still only 29, Clara protested, "and working harder than any 3 women I know. Rest, Clara. Let others help you for once." It was good advice, but hard to follow. The ranch was expanding. They'd bought the adjacent property when it came up for sale, doubling their grazing land. The school was thriving, but required constant attention, and Hope, now walking and talking with determination, if not clarity, required vigilant supervision. "Mama out" was Hope's favorite phrase, usually accompanied by pointing at the door and an imperious expression that reminded Clara forcefully of Jonah when he was determined about something. One morning in early April, Clara was teaching while Ruth handled the younger students when she felt a familiar sensation, her water breaking. She managed to calmly finish her lesson-assigned homework and dismiss the class before telling Ruth what was happening. "Go," Ruth said immediately. "I'll get Jonah." This labor was different from Hope's slower, more intense. Clara labored through the night and into the next day, Jonah never leaving her side despite her telling him repeatedly that he didn't need to suffer with her. "Where else would I be?" he said, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "You're doing the hard work. Least I can do is be here." Finally, as dawn broke on April 5th, their son was born healthy, loud, and, according to Doc Morrison, the biggest baby he'd delivered in years. 10 pounds if he's an ounce," the doctor said, handing the squalling infant to Clara. "No wonder you were tired. You were carrying a small giant." They named him Thomas James McAllister, Thomas for Tom, who'd become like Family James for Jonah's father. Tom, when told, actually cried, though he tried to hide it by claiming dust in his eyes. "Awful lot of dust in here," he muttered, holding his namesake for the first time. "Strange how it only affects the eyes when you're holding babies." Hope was initially suspicious of this loud, attention-stealing interloper, but soon decided baby Thomas was acceptable as long as he didn't touch her toys. She appointed herself his guardian, patting his head sometimes too enthusiastically and announcing to anyone who would listen, "My baby." As Clara recovered from childbirth, spring exploded across the prairie. The ranch was busier than ever, with new calves, the expanded territory to manage, and plans for bringing in horses. The school year was winding down, with Ruth proving invaluable in managing things during Clara's confinement. In May, just as Clara was preparing to return to teaching for the last weeks before summer break, another letter arrived from Boston. But this one wasn't from Louise. It was from a lawyer informing her that her great-aunt Millicent had died and left Clara a substantial inheritance. $20,000, Clara read in shock. "I barely knew Aunt Millicent. She never even acknowledged me after the scandal." "Maybe that was her way of making amends," Jonah suggested, reading over her shoulder. Clara stared at the letter. $20,000 was a fortune enough to live comfortably for years. In Boston, it would have meant salvation. But now, "What should we do with it?" she asked Jonah. "It's your inheritance, your choice." Clara thought for several days, then made her decision. Half would go to expanding the school building, a proper 2-room schoolhouse with living quarters for teachers, buying books and supplies, creating a scholarship fund for families who couldn't afford the small fees. The other half would be invested in the ranch, particularly in Jonah's dream of raising horses. "Are you sure?" Jonah asked. "This money could give you independent security." "I have those things," Clara said firmly. "What I want is to build something lasting, a legacy for our children and our community." The announcement of the school expansion was met with enthusiasm. By summer's end, construction was underway on what would be the finest school building in 3 counties. Clara and Ruth spent weeks planning curriculum, ordering books from as far away as San Francisco and even New York. The horse program also began that summer, with Jonah purchasing breeding stock from a renowned ranch in Texas. Pete, who had a natural gift with horses, was put in charge of the program with a raise in wages and a percentage of future sales. "You're building an empire," Elizabeth Morgan said admiringly as she watched the new school taking shape. "The McAllister Educational and Agricultural Empire." "We're building a future," Clara corrected, "for Hope and Thomas and all the children who will come after." As summer turned to autumn, Clara stood once again at the schoolhouse door, but this time welcoming students to a proper building with 2 classrooms, a library corner, and even a small laboratory for science experiments. 28 students enrolled ranging from age 5 to 17. Ruth Washington took the younger students while Clara handled the older ones, and they team-taught subjects like history and literature. The integration of Ruth as a teacher had gone more smoothly than anyone expected, perhaps because she was so obviously competent, perhaps because the community was learning to judge by character rather than color. There were still problems. A few families kept their children home rather than have them taught by a colored woman, and there were occasional ugly incidents in town. But overall, the Washingtons had become part of the community fabric, with Samuel's carpentry skills in high demand and their children playing freely with the other ranch children. One October afternoon, Clara was teaching advanced mathematics to her older students when she noticed a familiar figure on horseback approaching through the window. It was a woman riding astride rather than side-saddle, her posture confident, despite her obvious Eastern clothing. Clara excused herself and went to the door, then gasped in recognition. It was Charlotte Blackwood. Martha Blackwood's daughter, whom Clara had heard had been sent back east to finishing school after showing too much spirit for her mother's liking. "Charlotte," Clara called, "what are you doing here?" Charlotte dismounted, and Clara could see she'd been crying. "Mrs. McAllister, I need help. Mother's arranging a marriage for me to a man older than my father, a business associate from St. Louis who needs a young wife to prove his virility. I won't do it." Clara's heart clenched, remembering her own desperate flight from Boston. "Come inside, we'll figure something out." Clara led Charlotte into the small office she'd created in the new schoolhouse, closing the door to give them privacy, while Ruth continued with the lessons. The girl was trembling, her refined features drawn with exhaustion and fear. "Tell me everything," Clara said, gently pouring Charlotte a glass of water from the pitcher on her desk. Charlotte took a shaky breath. "Mr. Cornelius Bauer. He's 53 years old, owns several factories in St. Louis. His wife died last year, and he wants a young bride to give him more sons. Mother sees it as a business opportunity he's promised to invest in father's bank." Her voice broke. "She told me I should be grateful for such a prosperous match." Clara felt the old fury rise in her chest, the same rage she'd felt when William Hartley had tried to claim her. "And your father? What does he say?" "Father does whatever mother tells him," Charlotte said bitterly. "He's too weak to stand up to her, always has been. But Mrs. McAllister, I want to go to college. I want to study medicine. I've been corresponding with a women's medical college in Philadelphia. They've accepted me for next year if I can find a way to attend." "Your mother doesn't know about this." "Of course not. She'd burn the letters if she knew. She says education makes women unmarriageable." Charlotte laughed bitterly, as if being marriageable to a man like Cornelius Bauer is something to aspire to. Clara studied the girl woman really. Charlotte was 19 with intelligent eyes and a determined set to her chin that reminded Clara of herself at that age. But Charlotte had something Clara hadn't had then, someone who understood someone who could help. "Where is your mother now?" Clara asked. "In town at the hotel. She thinks I'm visiting the dressmaker about my wedding clothes. The wedding is planned for next month. Mr. Bauer is coming to collect me in 2 weeks." Clara stood pacing to the window where she could see her students working diligently under Ruth's supervision. Hope was in the corner playing with blocks while Thomas napped in his cradle, her children growing up free to choose their own paths. "Charlotte, what I'm about to suggest will cause a scandal. Your mother will never forgive you. Society, at least the society your mother values, will shun you. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared for anything that doesn't involve marrying that man," Charlotte said fiercely. Clara nodded, decision made. "Then here's what we're going to do. You'll stay here at the ranch. Your mother will rage and threaten, but she has no legal power to force you into marriage. You're of age. We'll protect you until she gives up and goes back to St. Louis." But then what I have no money of my own, no way to get to Philadelphia. The school has a scholarship fund, Clara interrupted. It was meant for local students, but I think helping a young woman pursue medical education qualifies. You'll work as a teaching assistant to earn your room and board until you leave for college. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. You do that for me, even though my mother has been nothing but cruel to you. I'm doing it because it's right, Clara said. And because someone once took a chance on me when I had nowhere else to turn. Now let's get you to the ranch before your mother realizes you're missing. The storm Clara predicted arrived within hours. Martha Blackwood descended on the ranch like an avenging fury, demanding her daughter be returned immediately. She's a foolish, ungrateful child who doesn't know what's best for her. Martha raged, standing in Clara's parlor while Jonah stood protectively beside his wife. You have no right to interfere in family matters. Charlotte is 19 years old, Clara said calmly, though her hands were clenched in her lap. She's legally an adult who can make her own choices. She's my daughter. No, Mrs. Blackwood. She's a person, not property to be sold to the highest bidder. Martha's face went purple with rage. How dare you of all people, dare to lecture me on propriety? Everyone knows what you were in Boston, a fallen woman who threw herself at a man above her station. The room went deadly quiet. Jonah started to move forward, but Clara stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. Let's talk about what everyone knows, Clara said, standing slowly. Everyone knows I was a respected teacher who defended herself against assault. Everyone knows I came here with nothing and built a new life through hard work and determination. Everyone knows I've educated the children of this valley, helped save the Hendersons when they lost everything, and welcomed strangers in need. She stepped closer to Martha, who actually backed up a step. And everyone knows you're trying to sell your daughter to a man old enough to be her grandfather for financial gain. Which one of us should be ashamed, Mrs. Blackwood? I'll ruin you, Martha hissed. I'll make sure everyone from here to San Francisco knows exactly what you are. A successful rancher's wife, a respected teacher, a mother raising her children to think for themselves. Clara smiled coldly. Do your worst, Mrs. Blackwood. I've survived worse than you. Martha stormed out, but not before delivering a parting shot. Charlotte will get nothing from us, not a penny. She'll be dead to us. After she left, Charlotte emerged from the kitchen where she'd been hiding with Jenny and Hope. Her face was pale, but determined. She means it, Charlotte said. I'm disinherited. Then you'll make your own fortune, Clara said firmly, starting with your education. The community's reaction to Charlotte's rebellion was mixed, but largely supportive. Most had little sympathy for Martha Blackwood's social pretensions, and the idea of forcing a young woman into marriage with an old man didn't sit well with frontier sensibilities. Good for the girl, Elizabeth Morgan declared at the next sewing circle, and good for Clara for helping her. Even some unexpected voices spoke up in support. Dorothy Chen, who knew something about defying social expectations, offered Charlotte a job helping in her husband's store to earn pocket money. The Washingtons, understanding what it meant to flee oppression, welcomed her warmly. Within a week, Charlotte had settled into life at the ranch, sharing the small room that had once been Clara's when she first arrived. She threw herself into teaching with enthusiasm, particularly enjoying science lessons where her pre-medical studies proved useful. You're a natural teacher, Ruth observed, watching Charlotte help the younger children with their reading. I love it, Charlotte admitted. Though I still want to be a doctor. Imagine being able to heal people to save lives. Why not do both? Clara suggested. This territory needs doctors who can also educate people about health and hygiene. As autumn deepened into winter, the ranch thrived despite Martha Blackwood's attempts at sabotage. She'd tried to organize a boycott of the school, but only 2 families withdrew their children, and 3 new families enrolled theirs, having heard about the quality of education offered. The horse breeding program was showing promise, with several foals expected in spring. The cattle operation had expanded to nearly 1,000 head, and the school had become known throughout the territory as one of the best, with families actually moving to the area specifically for the education. One snowy December evening, as Clara played piano while Charlotte helped Hope practice her letters, and Jonah held Thomas, she reflected on how far they'd all come. 2.5 years ago, she'd been a desperate woman fleeing scandal. Now she was the center of a growing, thriving community. Mama played Jingle Bells, Hope demanded, abandoning her letters to dance around the room. Clara obliged, and soon they were all singing, even baby Thomas gurgling along happily. Charlotte's clear soprano harmonized beautifully with Jonah's baritone, creating a perfect moment of family harmony. But the peace was shattered the next morning when Tom rode in fast from checking the fence lines, his face grim. "Rustlers hit the Morgans again," he reported. "But this time they left something behind, a message. Says they're coming for the biggest ranches next, mentions us specifically." Jonah's face hardened. How many cattle did the Morgans lose? 50 head. But Jonah, that's not the worst of it. They shot Jim Morgan when he tried to stop them. Doc's with him now, but it doesn't look good. Clara felt ice in her veins. Jim Morgan was Elizabeth's husband, a good man who'd always been kind to her. And if the rustlers were becoming violent, targeting specific ranches... "We need to organize," Jonah said. "Get word to all the ranches. We'll post guards, coordinate patrols." "I'll ride to town, alert the sheriff," Tom offered. "I'll go with you," Charlotte said unexpectedly. When everyone looked at her in surprise, she lifted her chin. "I can shoot. Father insisted I learn back when we lived in Colorado. I'm a good rider, and you need every hand you can get." Clara wanted to protest Charlotte was her responsibility, under her protection, but she recognized the determined look in the girl's eyes, the same need to be useful to fight back that Clara herself had felt. "Be careful," was all she said. The next weeks were tense. Jim Morgan survived, but would never walk properly again. The sheriff organized a posse, but the rustlers seemed to vanish like smoke whenever pursued. Every ranch in the valley stood on alert, men taking turns standing guard through the cold nights. Clara and the other women organized too, creating a system where families could signal for help, establishing safe houses where women and children could gather if violence erupted. The school became an unofficial communications center, with students carrying messages between ranches. It was actually one of Clara's students who spotted the rustlers. Timothy Crawford, now 14 and helping his father with night watch, saw fires in a canyon where there shouldn't be any. By dawn, the sheriff and a large posse had surrounded the rustlers' camp. The confrontation was brief but violent. 3 rustlers were killed in the gunfight, 5 captured. Among the captured was someone unexpected, Marcus Bauer, nephew of the very Cornelius Bauer that Charlotte had been supposed to marry. He was scouting for his uncle, the sheriff explained to Jonah and Clara later. Apparently, Cornelius Bauer has been building a cattle empire through rustling and intimidation. Young Marcus here was identifying the best targets, the richest ranches. Clara felt sick. Charlotte was supposed to marry into that family. "Seems like the young lady had good instincts," the sheriff said. "Marcus is talking, trying to save his own neck. Says his uncle's been doing this for years, using marriage to get close to wealthy families, then destroying them from within." The revelation sent shockwaves through the territory. Cornelius Bauer was arrested in St. Louis, his empire crumbling as investigators uncovered years of criminal activity. Martha Blackwood, whose husband had narrowly avoided financial entanglement with Bauer, left for San Francisco in disgrace, unable to face the community she'd tried so hard to dominate. "She didn't even say goodbye," Charlotte said, staring at the letter her mother had left at the hotel. It was brief and cold, formally disowning Charlotte and forbidding her from using the Blackwood name. "I'm sorry," Claire said, putting an arm around the girl's shoulders. "I'm not," Charlotte said firmly. "I'm free. For the first time in my life, I'm truly free." Spring came early that year, bringing with it changes both expected and surprising. The foals Jonah had hoped for arrived healthy and strong, including one exceptional colt that Pete declared would be a champion. The school prepared for its largest graduating class, yet 5 students who'd completed their basic education and were ready for higher learning or trades. Clara was helping Charlotte prepare for her departure to medical college when another unexpected visitor arrived. This time, it was a delegation from the territorial government. "Mrs. McAllister," the lead man said, removing his hat respectfully. "We're here to discuss education in the territory. Your school has gained quite a reputation." They offered Clara the position of territorial education superintendent, overseeing the establishment of schools throughout Wyoming. It would mean travel meetings, a salary larger than she'd ever imagined. "It's a tremendous honor," Clara said carefully. "But I need to discuss it with my husband." That evening, she and Jonah sat on their porch watching Hope chase fireflies, while Thomas toddled after her, always a few steps behind his adventurous sister. "It's an amazing opportunity," Jonah said. "You could shape education for the entire territory. But it would mean leaving the ranch for weeks at a time, being away from you, from the children. We'd manage. The question is, what do you want?" Clara thought about it for long moments. "I want to make a difference, but I also want to be here watching our children grow, teaching the students I've come to love. I think I can do more good here, creating a model that others can follow than I could trying to manage from afar." She declined the superintendent position, but agreed to serve as an advisor, helping establish curriculum and teacher training programs. It was a compromise that let her maintain her roots while still spreading her influence. Charlotte left for Philadelphia in May, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Clara goodbye. "I wouldn't have made it without you," she said. "You saved my life." "You saved yourself," Clara corrected. "I just opened a door. You were brave enough to walk through it." As Charlotte's stage disappeared into the distance, Clara felt Jonah's arm come around her waist. "You're building quite a legacy, Boston," he said. "Students going to college schools being modeled after yours, young women finding the courage to chase their dreams." "We're building it," Clara corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." That summer brought a terrible drought. The grass turned brown, water sources dried up, and cattle began to weaken. Every rancher in the valley struggled, but they struggled together, sharing what water they had, working together to drive herds to distant water sources. It was during this crisis that Samuel Washington proved his true value to the community. His experience from farming in the South included knowledge of irrigation techniques that most Western ranchers had never considered. "We can dig channels from the mountain streams," he explained at an emergency meeting. "Direct water to holding ponds. It won't solve everything, but it'll help." The entire community worked together on the irrigation project, black and white established families and newcomers, all united in survival. Clara and Ruth organized the children to help, turning it into lessons on engineering and cooperation. By the time the drought broke in September, the community had not just survived but grown stronger. The shared hardship had broken down the last barriers between the established families and newcomers like the Washingtons. "You know what I love about this place?" Ruth said to Clara as they watched their students play together. "Skin colors varied as autumn leaves, but all equally dusty from their games. It's becoming what America promised to be, but never quite managed. A place where what you do matters more than who you were born as." "It's not perfect," Clara said, knowing there were still prejudices, still problems. "No, but it's trying. That's more than most places can say." That Christmas was especially joyous, the community celebrating not just the season, but their survival of the drought. The school pageant had to be held in the largest barn because so many people wanted to attend. Hope, now 3, played Mary with great seriousness, while Thomas, 18 months, was a shepherd who kept trying to catch the real sheep someone had foolishly brought for authenticity. Charlotte sent a letter from Philadelphia full of excitement about her studies and gratitude for the scholarship that made it possible. She was top of her class, the only woman fighting for respect, but thriving on the challenge. "That could have been me," Clara said to Jonah that night, as they lay in bed listening to a winter storm blow outside. "If things had been different in Boston, if I'd had the chances Charlotte has—" "Then you wouldn't be here," Jonah pointed out. "And neither would I, not in any way that mattered. I'd still be that lonely rancher, existing but not living." "Fate works in strange ways," Clara murmured, snuggling closer to his warmth. "Maybe, or maybe we make our own fate by the choices we face when life breaks us. You chose to answer an advertisement. I chose to look past tears to see strength. We chose to build something together." The new year of 1877 brought unexpected news. Clara was pregnant again, something she'd hoped for, but wasn't sure would happen as she approached 30. This pregnancy felt different, easier somehow, as if her body remembered what to do. The school continued to thrive under Clara and Ruth's leadership, with enrollment reaching 35 students. They'd had to hire another teacher, a young man from Denver, who'd come west for his health and proved gifted with mathematics and sciences. Spring brought more foals, a good calf crop, and news that the railroad was definitely coming through the valley within 2 years. Land prices soared, and suddenly the McAllister Ranch was worth 10 times what Jonah had paid for it. "We could sell," Jonah mentioned one evening, not seriously but testing the waters. Take the money, move somewhere easier, California maybe, or even back east. Clara looked at him in horror. Leave? Leave our home, our community, everything we've built. Just checking, he grinned. Wanted to make sure you felt the same as me. This is our place where we made our stand. I couldn't leave either. In June, a letter arrived that made Clara's hands shake. It was from Louise, her Boston cousin, with news that seemed to come from another lifetime. William Hartley's father had died, and in his will, he'd left a substantial sum to Clara conscience money, the letter suggested, for what his son had done. $50,000, Clara read in disbelief. He left me $50,000. It was an enormous fortune, enough to live in luxury for the rest of their lives. But as Clara looked around at her children playing in the yard at the school, visible in the distance at Jonah, working with a young horse, she knew exactly what to do with it. Half went to establishing a permanent endowment for the school, ensuring it could operate regardless of economic changes. A quarter went to helping families like the Washingtons establish themselves a fund for newcomers needing a start. The remainder was invested in the ranch's future, particularly in buying strategic water rights that would protect them from future droughts. You could have kept it all, Elizabeth Morgan said when she heard. Nobody would have blamed you. What would I do with that much money? Clara asked. Buy fancy dresses. Build a mansion. I have everything I want, a loving family, meaningful work, a community that's become my true home. The money is just a tool to protect and nurture what really matters. On August 15th, 18... Clara gave birth to her third child, a daughter they named Louise Ruth McAllister. Louise for the cousin who'd stood by her, Ruth for the friend who'd become like a sister. The birth was easy, almost peaceful, with Clara joking between contractions that she was becoming an expert at this. 3 children in 4 years, Doc Morrison marveled. You're building your own small school right here at home. It was truer than he knew. Hope was already reading simple books Thomas showed mechanical aptitude that amazed everyone, and baby Louise seemed to observe everything with intelligent dark eyes. As autumn arrived, Clara stood in her classroom, baby Louise in a sling across her chest, teaching the Declaration of Independence to her older students. She emphasized the words, "All men are created equal," then added her own interpretation. The founders wrote men, but they meant humanity, she said. Every person, man, woman, black, white, rich, poor, has the same inherent worth, the same right to pursue happiness. That's the promise of America, even when America fails to live up to it. Maria Rodriguez raised her hand. Is that why you helped Charlotte and the Washingtons? That's why we help anyone who needs it, Clara said. Because every person deserves the chance to become who they're meant to be. After class, Clara walked home slowly, savoring the autumn air and the weight of her sleeping daughter. The ranch spread before her, the house expanded twice now, the barns full of healthy livestock, the horse pasture where Pete was training what would become champion bloodlines. Jonah met her at the door as he always did when he saw her coming, taking the baby so she could remove her coat. Good day, he asked their daily ritual. The best, she replied as she always did, meaning it every time. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Clara and Jonah, their 3 children. Tom, who ate with them more often than not, now Jenny, who'd become like an older daughter, and Pete, who was sweet on Jenny, though he thought nobody noticed. Clara felt the full weight of her contentment. Mama, tell the story, Hope demanded, as she often did. Which story, sweetheart? The story of how you came here, the real story. Clara looked at Jonah, who nodded. Their children would know their history, all of it, the struggles and triumphs alike. Well, Clara began. Once upon a time, there was a woman who thought her life was over. She'd lost everything, her work, her home, her good name. She got on a stagecoach with just one small bag and a lot of fear. But then what? Thomas interrupted, though he knew the story. But then she met a cowboy. Clara continued, smiling at Jonah. A good, kind cowboy who was lonely and looking for someone to share his dreams. And together they discovered that sometimes when you lose everything, you find exactly what you need. And they lived happily ever after, Hope asked. They lived, Clara said, looking around the table at the faces she loved. They lived fully and truly and well. And the story isn't over yet. It's still being written every single day. Outside, the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The cattle lowed in the distance, horses nickered in the barn, and Moses, old now but still faithful, barked at something only he could see. Clara reached for Jonah's hand under the table, feeling his fingers intertwine with hers, a connection that had begun with a desperate advertisement and a leap of faith and had become the foundation of everything good in her life. 5 years ago, she'd stepped off a stagecoach in tears, broken and afraid. Now she sat at her own table, surrounded by love and purpose, having discovered that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past, but transforming it into strength. The woman from Boston, who'd lost everything, had become Clara McAllister of Wyoming, who had everything that truly mattered. And as she looked at her family, her home, her life, she knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged.